The light was dying over the Texas plains, bleeding crimson across a sky that had forgotten mercy. Dusk in this land was never gentle. It came with teeth and claws, dragging shadows that stretched like hungry fingers across the parched earth. And through this fading light, Ruth Abernathy ran, as though the devil himself was on her heels. In truth, what pursued her was far more dangerous than any phantom. Three riders, their silhouettes sharp against the setting sun, drove their horses hard across the dusty terrain. The thunder of hooves carried on the evening air a drumbeat counting down the moments of her freedom. Perhaps the moments of her life. Ruth's breath came in ragged gasps, her skirts torn and heavy with dust. Blood had dried along her temple where a blow had landed hours earlier, and her dark hair had mostly escaped its pins, flowing wild behind her like a banner of defiance. 24 years old, and she was running for her life through a land that had already seen too much death. Ahead, the skeletal frame of an abandoned church rose from the earth, its wooden walls weathered gray by sun and wind. The steeple tilted precariously, as though it too was trying to escape this forsaken place. Ruth's legs burned with exhaustion, but the sight of shelter. Any shelter gave her a final surge of desperate energy. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, groaning like a wounded animal as she pushed it open and stumbled inside. The interior was bathed in amber light, filtering through broken windows, dust motes dancing in the slanted beams. Pews lay overturned hymn books scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. The altar stood barren, its cross long since carried away. But Ruth was not alone. A man knelt before the empty altar head, bowed in prayer. At the sound of the door, he turned, rising in one fluid motion that belied his years. Tall and lean, with shoulders that had once been powerful, but now carried an invisible weight. His face was weathered, like the church itself, lined with years and sorrows. A thick beard more salt than pepper framed a mouth that seemed unaccustomed to smiling. Yet his eyes, pale blue and startlingly clear, held no fear at the sudden intrusion, only a calm assessment. "Please," Ruth gasped, pressing her back against the door as though her slight frame could barricade it. "They're coming. They'll kill me." The man's gaze flickered to the blood on her temple, then to the torn sleeve of her dress, the bruises forming on her forearm. His expression didn't change, but something in those pale eyes shifted. "Who's coming?" His voice was low and rough, like stones being turned in a dry riverbed. Before Ruth could answer, the thunder of hooves grew louder, then abruptly stopped. Men's voices called to each other, boots hit the ground with dull thuds. "In there," a voice commanded. "The church! I saw her." The man moved with surprising speed for someone who appeared to be in his 50s. He crossed to Ruth, took her arm gently but firmly, and guided her toward a small door behind the pulpit. "Storage room," he murmured. "Stay quiet." Ruth hesitated, clutching a small worn Bible to her chest. "I'm not," she began, but the man cut her off with a slight shake of his head. "No time," he said, opening the door and guiding her inside. The space was little more than a closet smelling of old wood and forgotten prayers. "Whatever you are, it can wait." The door closed, leaving Ruth in darkness broken only by thin lines of light around the frame. Through these she could see the man return to the main area of the church, his movements unhurried now, deliberate. He picked up a saddlebag from beside the altar, she hadn't noticed it before, and slung it over his shoulder just as the main door was thrown open. Three men entered, spurs jingling with each step. Their leader stood at the center, tall and broad-shouldered, with the arrogant posture of a man accustomed to power. A badge gleamed on his chest, catching the dying light. His companions flanked him, hands resting casually on holstered pistols. "Evening, gentlemen," the older man said, his tone neutral. "Church is abandoned, as you can see. Not much left to steal, if that's your intention." The leader's laugh was short and sharp, like the crack of a whip. "We're not thieves, old man. I'm Sheriff Clayton Hargrove." He tapped the badge. "These are my deputies. We're pursuing a fugitive, a young woman, dark hair. Dangerous. Seen anyone like that?" In her hiding place, Ruth pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle any sound. Sheriff. The word was a mockery. Clayton had only been appointed after the federal troops came a reward for his loyalty to the new order, not for any sense of justice. The older man shrugged. "Been alone with my prayers. Haven't seen a soul in days." Clayton's eyes narrowed as he scanned the church. "You live here, old-timer, just passing through, like yourself." The man shifted his weight, and for the first time Ruth noticed the rifle propped against the wall behind him within easy reach. "What did this woman do?" "Murdered a man," Clayton said, his hand moving to rest on his own pistol. "Stabbed him while he slept. Dangerous and disturbed." Through the crack in the door, Ruth could see the older man's expression remain impassive, though something flickered in those pale eyes. "That so," he said. "Must be quite a woman to take on a man in his sleep." Clayton's face darkened. "She's clever and desperate now. You sure you haven't seen her lying to a sheriff is a serious offense." The older man picked up his rifle, but casually, as though merely preparing to leave. "I've seen enough of war and death to last a lifetime, Sheriff. Have no interest in seeing more. Now, if you don't mind daylight's wasting, and I've got miles to cover." For a tense moment, the two men stared at each other. Clayton was younger armed and had his deputies beside him. But something in the older man's steady gaze made him hesitate. "Search the place," Clayton ordered his men. "Every corner." Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs as footsteps approached her hiding place. She clutched her Bible tighter, pressing herself into the darkest corner. The footsteps stopped outside the door. "What's in here?" one of the deputies called. The older man answered before Clayton could. "Storage closet. Empty now, save for some rat droppings and old hymn books." A hand grasped the door handle. Ruth closed her eyes. "Leave it," Clayton called suddenly. "Place is falling apart, probably full of snakes. We're wasting time." His voice hardened. "But I'll be watching this area, old man. If I find out you're lying to me—" The threat hung in the air, unfinished, but clear. "Safe travels, Sheriff," the older man replied, his tone giving nothing away. The footsteps retreated. The main door creaked open, then closed with a thud that echoed through the empty church. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of horses moving away. Ruth didn't move, unsure if it was truly safe. The storage room door opened, and the man stood silhouetted against the fading light. "They're gone," he said. For now. Ruth emerged slowly, still clutching her Bible. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," he interrupted. "They'll be back. Men like that always come back." "You didn't give me up?" It wasn't a question, but a statement of wonder. The man studied her, his gaze lingering on her injuries. "Did you murder someone like he said?" Ruth's fingers tightened around her Bible. She met his gaze directly, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "I'm not a murderer, but I'm not—" She swallowed hard. "I'm not clean anymore." The man nodded once, as though her cryptic answer told him everything he needed to know. "Name's Jedediah Foster," he said. "You look like you could use some water and rest." "Ruth," she replied. Ruth Abernathy. Jedediah moved to the window, peering out at the darkening landscape. My horse is out back. We need to move. This will be the first place they check when they circle back. Where would we go? I have a place. Isolated. Few hours' ride from here. He turned to face her. Unless you have somewhere else in mind. Ruth shook her head. She had no home to return to, no family waiting. Not anymore. Why would you help me? She asked. You don't know me. Jedediah gathered his few belongings, his movements efficient. Let's just say I've seen enough injustice to recognize it. He paused, then added, and enough wounds to know which ones come from fighting back. Ruth unconsciously touched her bruised cheek. He'll keep looking. Yes? Jedediah agreed. He will. He handed her a canteen. Drink, then we ride. The night settled over the plains like a shroud as they rode away from the abandoned church. Jedediah's horse, a sturdy sorrel gelding, carried them both without complaint, though Ruth could feel the animal's steady breathing beneath her. She sat behind Jedediah, her arms tentatively circling his waist for balance. The moon rose, casting silver light across the landscape, transforming it into something ancient and ethereal. Stars emerged, countless and brilliant, in the vast Texas sky. Under different circumstances, Ruth might have found it beautiful. They rode in silence for the most part. Jedediah focused on the path ahead, Ruth lost in her own thoughts. It was only after they crossed a shallow creek, the water gleaming like polished metal in the moonlight, that Jedediah spoke. You want to tell me what really happened? Ruth's arms tightened slightly around his waist. She had been waiting for this question, dreading it. The truth sat like a stone in her throat. My husband died in the war. She began, her voice barely audible over the horse's steady gait. He fought for the Confederacy. I was alone after that, trying to keep our small farm. Jedediah listened without interrupting, his back straight against her. When the federal troops came, everything changed. Clayton was appointed as the new authority in our town. Ruth paused, the words sticking in her throat. He said I owed taxes, that he could take the farm unless I showed my appreciation for his protection. The night air grew colder, or perhaps it was just the chill of memory that made Ruth shiver. He forced himself on me. She continued, her voice flat now, stripped of emotion. More than once. Said it was my duty as a Southern woman to submit to the new order. A bitter laugh escaped her. Last night he came again, drunk, angrier than usual. I had a kitchen knife under my pillow. When he tried to... She stopped, unable to continue. You defended yourself, Jedediah said simply. Ruth nodded, though he couldn't see it. I stabbed him in the shoulder. He was bleeding, but alive when I ran. He was screaming that he'd see me hang for attacking an officer of the law. They crested a small rise, and in the distance Ruth could make out the dark outline of a house against the night sky. Jedediah guided the horse toward it. Why didn't you tell them the truth, that it was self-defense? He asked. Truth. Ruth's laugh was hollow. What truth matters now? The war's over, but not for men like Clayton. They just wear different uniforms, carry different flags, and who would believe me against the new sheriff? Jedediah was silent for a long moment. I would, he said finally. They approached the house, a modest structure of weathered wood with a wide porch wrapping around the front. A barn stood nearby its door, hanging open like a yawning mouth in the darkness. The place looked solid, if worn by time and elements. Home, Jedediah said, drawing the horse to a stop. Such as it is. He dismounted first, then offered a hand to help Ruth down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground hours on horseback, after her desperate flight had left her muscles trembling with exhaustion. Jedediah steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Easy," he said. "We're safe for tonight, at least." The interior of the house was spare but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold now but ready for flame. A table and 2 chairs stood nearby, a kerosene lamp hanging unlit above them. A doorway led to what appeared to be a bedroom, and a rough staircase climbed to a loft. What caught Ruth's attention, however, were the books. They lined one entire wall on crude shelves, more books than she had ever seen outside a proper library. And interspersed among them dozens of envelopes, yellowed with age, stacked in neat piles. Jedediah moved around the room with practiced efficiency, lighting the lamp, bringing water from a pump in the kitchen area. He gestured to a chair. "Sit. You look ready to fall over." Ruth sank gratefully into the offered seat, her gaze still drawn to the wall of books. Most appeared to be medical texts, their spines bearing titles about anatomy, surgery, and diseases. Others were clearly Bibles, different sizes and bindings, but unmistakable. "You're a doctor," she said, the realization dawning. Jedediah set a cup of water before her. "Was," he corrected, "a lifetime ago." "During the war." A shadow crossed his face. "Yes, Army surgeon, Union Army." Ruth's hand froze halfway to the cup. Union. The enemy. The men who had killed her husband, burned cities, brought men like Clayton to power. She looked at Jedediah with new eyes, searching for signs of the monster she had been taught to hate. All she saw was a tired man. The lines in his face deepened by the lamplight, his pale eyes watching her reaction carefully. "You fought against the South," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I fought against death," he corrected. "Mostly lost." He pulled out the other chair and sat across from her. "I never fired a shot in anger, Mrs. Abernathy. I cut and stitched and amputated, tried to save whoever was brought to my tent, regardless of the color of their uniform." Ruth's shoulders relaxed slightly. She took a sip of water, then another, suddenly aware of how parched her throat was. "My husband," she said after a moment, "Thomas, he died at Gettysburg." Jedediah nodded, his expression solemn. "I was there," he said simply. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken histories, with blood spilled and lives lost. The war had ended 9 years ago, but its shadows lingered, particularly here in the disputed territories where the wounds remained raw. "You should rest," Jedediah said at last, breaking the silence. "You can take the bedroom. I'll sleep up in the loft." Ruth shook her head. "I can't take your bed." "You're injured and exhausted," he interrupted, "and I suspect you haven't slept properly in days. Take the bed, Mrs. Abernathy. There'll be time for proper manners when you're stronger." Too tired to argue further, Ruth nodded. As she rose, her gaze fell on one of the stacks of envelopes on the shelves. The top one was addressed in a careful hand, "To my beloved Hannah." Jedediah followed her gaze. Something in his expression closed like shutters being drawn against a storm. "Good night, Mrs. Abernathy," he said, his tone making it clear that questions about the letters would not be welcome. "Good night, Mr. Foster. And thank you." The bedroom was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a faded quilt. A washstand held a pitcher and bowl, and a small window looked out onto the moonlit plains. Ruth washed as best she could, with the cold water wincing as she cleaned the cut on her temple. The bed creaked as she lay down, still fully clothed, save for her boots. She placed her small Bible on the table beside the bed, her fingers lingering on its worn cover. Inside the front cover, faded ink spelled out, To Ruth, may your faith guide you through darkness. With love, Thomas. Ruth closed her eyes, too exhausted even for tears. Sleep came quickly, dragging her down into darkness. But the darkness wasn't empty. It was filled with Clayton's face, his hands, his weight pressing her down. She woke with a start. A scream caught in her throat. The room was still dark, though a faint grayness around the edges of the window suggested dawn was approaching. Ruth lay motionless, her heart racing, listening to the silence of the house. Then she heard it, the soft sound of movement from the main room. Quietly she rose and moved to the door, opening it just enough to peer through. Jedediah sat at the table, a single candle burning beside him. He was writing, his hand moving steadily across a sheet of paper. Beside him lay an open letter that he occasionally glanced at, his expression one of deep sorrow. As Ruth watched, he finished writing, folded the paper carefully, and slipped it into an envelope. He added it to one of the stacks on the shelves, his fingers lingering on the pile as though reluctant to let go. Ruth closed the door silently and returned to bed. She didn't sleep again that night, her mind filled with questions about the man who had saved her and the letters he wrote that were never sent. Morning brought clarity and caution. Ruth emerged from the bedroom to find Jedediah already up and moving about the house. A fire burned in the fireplace, and the smell of coffee filled the air. Outside, the sun was rising over the plains, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. "There's coffee," Jedediah said by way of greeting, "and some cornbread from yesterday. Not much, but it'll keep you going." Ruth accepted the offered cup gratefully. "Thank you for everything." Jedediah nodded, his attention focused on gathering supplies into a saddlebag. "We need to discuss what happens next," he said. "Clayton and his men will be searching. They'll eventually find this place." "I can leave," Ruth said quickly. "I don't want to bring trouble to your door." "And go where?" Jedediah asked, his tone not unkind, but practical. "Without a horse, supplies, or protection." Ruth had no answer. The reality of her situation pressed down on her like a physical weight. She was a fugitive, now accused of a crime that carried a hanging sentence. "I've been thinking," Jedediah continued, setting down the saddlebag. "This property is remote. Few people know of it. We have time, not much, but some, to consider options." "Options?" Ruth's laugh was bitter. "What options does a woman like me have? Clayton has the law on his side, corrupted as it is." "The law, yes," Jedediah agreed, "but not justice." He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from her. "Tell me more about this Clayton Hargrove. How long has he been sheriff?" Ruth's fingers tightened around her cup. "Since the federal authorities came about 2 years ago. He wasn't elected. He was appointed." She looked up, meeting Jedediah's steady gaze. "He was a Confederate officer during the war. Now he acts like he owns the county because he switched sides at the right moment." Jedediah's expression remained neutral, but something sharpened in his eyes. "A Confederate officer who now serves the Union. Serves himself more like," Ruth corrected. "He collects taxes, enforces the new laws when it suits him. The federal troops are stationed in the larger towns. They don't bother much with our small community. Clayton has free rein. And he's used that freedom to prey on women like yourself," Jedediah said, his voice hardening. "Women left vulnerable by the war." Ruth looked away, shame coloring her cheeks. "I'm not the only one," she admitted quietly. "But most just endure it. Keep silent." "But you fought back." "I didn't plan to," Ruth said, her voice barely audible. "I just couldn't bear it anymore. His hands on me, his weight." She shuddered. I reached for the knife without thinking. Jedediah was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle. You have nothing to be ashamed of, Mrs. Abernathy. The shame belongs solely to him. Ruth looked up, surprised by the conviction in his tone. You believe me, then, that I didn't try to murder him? I've seen enough wounds in my time to know the difference between an attack and a defense, Jedediah said. He hesitated, then added, May I? He gestured toward her injured temple. Ruth nodded, and he moved his chair closer, his touch clinical but gentle as he examined the cut. This needs proper cleaning, he said. And the bruising on your arms, defensive wounds. You were protecting yourself. His eyes met hers. As was your right. Something in his calm acceptance broke through the wall Ruth had built around her emotions. Tears filled her eyes, spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. I prayed, she whispered. Every time, prayed for strength to endure, for God to change his heart, for my husband's spirit to forgive me. Jedediah's brow furrowed. Forgive you? For what? For being violated, for being unable to stop it. Ruth's voice broke. For being impure now. Jedediah's expression softened with understanding. Faith offers comfort, Mrs. Abernathy, but sometimes it can also be twisted to inflict unnecessary guilt. He gestured to the many Bibles on his shelves. I've read enough scripture to know that the sin and impurity lie with the one who commits violence, not with the one who suffers it. Ruth wiped her tears with the back of her hand. My faith is all I have left, she said. That and this. She touched the small Bible in her pocket. It was Thomas's. He carried it through the war. Jedediah rose and went to a cabinet, returning with a small medical kit. As he cleaned and dressed, her temple wound. His touch remained gentle, but impersonal. Your husband, he said as he worked, would be proud of your courage. Ruth closed her oily eyes, allowing herself to believe his words, if only for a moment. When she opened them again, she found Jedediah studying her with an unreadable expression. What is it? She asked. Instead of answering directly, he asked, May I see your Bible? Puzzled, Ruth handed it to him. Jedediah opened it carefully, examining the inscription inside the cover. Thomas Abernathy, he read aloud. He was infantry. Yes, Ruth said. 18th Virginia. Jedediah nodded slowly, returning the Bible to her. I treated many men from Virginia at Gettysburg, he said, both before and after the battle. Did you? Ruth hesitated, afraid to hope. Did you ever meet him, Thomas? I don't recall the name, Jedediah said truthfully. But I saw hundreds of men in those days. The faces blur together after a while. He finished bandaging her temple. There, that should heal cleanly now. Ruth touched the bandage lightly. You're still a doctor, whether you claim the title or not. A shadow crossed Jedediah's face. A doctor heals, he said. I couldn't save enough of them. Before Ruth could respond, a sound from outside caught their attention, the distant but unmistakable rhythm of hoofbeats. Jedediah moved swiftly to the window, peering out cautiously. Rider coming, he said, his voice tense. Just one from the east. Ruth stood, her heart racing. Clayton. Can't tell yet, but we should prepare for the worst. Jedediah moved to a cabinet and removed a revolver, checking it quickly before handing it to Ruth. Do you know how to use this? Ruth took the gun, its weight unfamiliar and frightening in her hand. No, she admitted. Thomas tried to teach me once, but I couldn't bear the sound. Jedediah nodded, taking the weapon back. Stay inside, away from the windows. I'll handle this. He moved to the door, the revolver held low at his side. Ruth followed despite his instructions, stopping just inside as he stepped onto the porch. The rider was closer now, a solitary figure against the vast landscape. As he approached, Ruth could make out more details. An older man, his white beard visible even at a distance, riding a mule rather than a horse. He wore no badge, no uniform, just the plain clothes of a farmer or laborer. Jedediah's posture relaxed slightly, though he kept the revolver ready. "Ezekiel," he called when the rider was within earshot. "Early for your monthly visit." The rider Ezekiel raised a hand in greeting. "Thought you might want some news, Jed," he called back. His voice carried the rich cadence of the South, but with an undercurrent that marked him as different from most men Ruth had known. As he drew closer, Ruth realized what set him apart. Ezekiel was a black man, his skin deep brown against the white of his beard, his age perhaps 70 or more. He dismounted with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested such actions, tethering his mule to the porch rail. "Got company, I see," Ezekiel said, nodding toward Ruth, still visible in the doorway. "Unusual for you, Jed." "Unusual times," Jedediah replied, tucking the revolver into his belt. "Come in. Coffee's hot." Ezekiel climbed the porch steps, his gaze taking in Ruth's bandaged temple and wary stance. He removed his hat as he approached, revealing a crown of white hair. "Ma'am," he said, inclining his head respectfully. "Ezekiel Wheeler." "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Ruth managed, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Her experience with freed slaves was limited. Most had left the area after emancipation, seeking opportunities elsewhere. "I'm Ruth Abernathy." Inside, Jedediah poured coffee for Ezekiel, who settled into a chair with a grateful sigh. "These old bones don't take to riding like they used to," he said. "You mentioned news." Jedediah prompted, his tone casual but his eyes alert. Ezekiel glanced at Ruth, then back to Jedediah. "There's a search party out of Oak Ridge," he said. "Sheriff and his deputies looking for a woman, offering a reward for information." Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. Oak Ridge was her town some 30 miles east. Clayton had wasted no time spreading the word of her crime. "What are they saying she did?" Jedediah asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Attempted murder of a lawman," Ezekiel replied. "Sheriff himself, according to the talk, stabbed him while he slept." He looked directly at Ruth. Didn't mention the part where he'd been forcing himself on her for months, of course. Ruth stared at the old man, shock rendering her momentarily speechless. "How did you—" "Word travels," Ezekiel said simply. "Especially among those who clean houses, cook meals, tend horses. We hear things." His gaze was knowing, compassionate. "And some of us remember how the sheriff treated colored women before he got that badge." Jedediah's expression hardened. "So it's a pattern with him." "Oh yes," Ezekiel confirmed, "long before the war ended. Only difference is now he has the law to hide behind." Ruth sank into a chair, the weight of this revelation settling over her. "I thought I was alone," she whispered. "That no one knew, or if they did, they didn't care." "People know," Ezekiel said. "Some care, but fear keeps mouths shut." He sipped his coffee. "Which brings me to the rest of my news. The search party isn't just the sheriff and his regular deputies. He's gathered a larger group." Jedediah frowned. "How many?" "Dozen or so," Ezekiel said. "Men from around the county, some former Confederate soldiers. They're calling themselves deputies now, but word is they've been meeting for months. Call themselves the Gray Knights, or some such foolishness." Ruth felt a chill run through her. "I've heard Thomas mention that name before the war. They hunted runaway slaves." Ezekiel nodded grimly. Among other activities, they mostly went underground during the occupation, but they're reforming now under Clayton's leadership, using the law as cover for their real purpose. Which is, Jedediah asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Taking back control, Ezekiel said. Restoring the proper order of things, starting with making examples of those who defy them. He looked pointedly at Ruth, like a woman who dares defend herself against one of their leaders. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Ruth wasn't just running from a corrupt sheriff, she was being hunted by an organized group with a larger agenda. Her personal tragedy had become a symbol in a continuing conflict. They know she's with me, Jedediah asked, breaking the silence. Not yet, Ezekiel said, but they're searching every homestead within 50 miles of Oak Ridge. It's only a matter of time. Jedediah moved to the window, gazing out at the vast landscape. How much time? 2 days. 3 at most. Ezekiel set down his cup. Which is why I rode out early to warn you. You need to decide what to do, and quickly. Ruth looked between the two men, confusion mingling with her fear. You know each other well, she observed. How? Ezekiel smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. Jed and I go back many years, to before the war. Ezekiel was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, Jedediah explained, still looking out the window. Helped slaves escape north. I provided medical assistance when needed. Ruth's eyes widened. The Underground Railroad was something spoken of in whispers, a network of secret routes and safe houses that had helped thousands of slaves escape to free states and Canada. You were an abolitionist, she asked Jedediah. He turned from the window, his expression unreadable. I believed in freedom and human dignity, he said simply. Still do. Ruth tried to reconcile this new information with her understanding of the world. She had been raised to view abolitionists as dangerous radicals, enemies of the Southern way of life. Yet this man had saved her, tended her wounds, offered her shelter. Thank you for the warning, Ezekiel, Jedediah said. Will you stay the night? The older man shook his head. Best I get back. My absence would be noted. He rose, placing his hat back on his head. But I'll return if I hear anything more. Jedediah walked him to the door. The two men spoke quietly on the porch, their voices too low for Ruth to hear. After a few minutes, Ezekiel mounted his mule and rode away, raising a hand in farewell. When Jedediah returned, his expression was grave. We need to prepare, he said. If they come, they won't be interested in talking. What can we do against so many? Ruth asked, her voice small. First, we make sure you can defend yourself, Jedediah said. He retrieved the revolver he had shown her earlier. It's time you learn to use this. Ruth stared at the weapon, remembering Thomas's attempts to teach her years ago. She had been so certain then that ladies had no need for such knowledge, that God and good men would protect her. How naive she had been. All right, she said, reaching for the gun. Teach me. Behind the house, a small clearing served as their practice ground. Jedediah set up bottles on a fallen log, pacing off a reasonable distance for a beginner. The first thing to understand, he said, is that a gun is just a tool, like a hammer or a saw. It has no will of its own. Ruth nodded, the revolver heavy in her hand. Thomas said something similar. He was right. Jedediah positioned himself beside her. Hold it with both hands like this, firm but not rigid. Ruth adjusted her grip, trying to ignore the trembling in her fingers. I'm afraid, she admitted. Good, Jedediah said. Fear keeps you respectful of the weapon's power. Now aim at that first bottle. Take your time. Ruth raised the gun sighting along the barrel as Thomas had once shown her. The bottle seemed impossibly small and far away. "I can't," she whispered. "You can," Jedediah countered. "Remember what Clayton did to you. What he'll do again if he catches you." Anger flared inside Ruth, hot and clarifying. She steadied her hands, focused on the bottle, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil was stronger than she expected, the sound deafening, despite Jedediah's warning. The bottle remained untouched. "Again," Jedediah said calmly. "Adjust your aim a little higher." Ruth fired a second time, a third. On the fourth shot, the bottle exploded into fragments. "I did it," she breathed, surprised and oddly exhilarated. "You did," Jedediah agreed. "Now, the next one." They practiced until Ruth's arms ached and her ears rang with the sound of gunfire. By the end, she could hit a bottle more often than not, though her accuracy at greater distances was still poor. "Enough for today," Jedediah said, taking the empty revolver from her. "You're a quick learner, Mrs. Abernathy." "Ruth," she said. "Please call me Ruth. After saving my life and teaching me to shoot, I think formality is unnecessary." A ghost of a smile touched Jedediah's lips. "Ruth, then." As they walked back to the house, Ruth found the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her since the previous night. "The letters," she said. "On your shelves. You write them, but they're never sent. Why—" Jedediah's stride faltered for just a moment. "Some questions are better left unasked," he said, his voice suddenly distant. "I'm sorry," Ruth said quickly. "I didn't mean to pry." Jedediah sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "No, I understand curiosity." He stopped, gazing out at the setting sun. "They're to my wife Hannah, and my daughter Sarah." Ruth waited, sensing there was more to the story, unwilling to push, but hoping he would continue. "They died," Jedediah said, after a long silence, "during the war, while I was away serving as a surgeon." His voice was flat, as though reciting facts from a medical text rather than describing personal tragedy. "Our home in Tennessee was burned. Retribution, they said, for my Union sympathies." "I'm so sorry," Ruth whispered, the words wholly inadequate for such loss. "I write to them," Jedediah continued as if he hadn't heard her. "Tell them about my days. Ask forgiveness for not being there to protect them." His pale eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a grief so profound it took her breath away. "Foolish, I know." "Not foolish," Ruth said. "I talk to Thomas sometimes. Tell him things. Ask questions he can never answer." Jedediah nodded, a moment of understanding passing between them. Two people marked by loss, standing in the dying light of a Texas evening. "We should get inside," he said, the personal moment closing as quickly as it had opened. "There's more to prepare, if we're going to be ready." The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Jedediah taught Ruth more about shooting, moving on to a rifle once she had mastered the basics of the revolver. They stockpiled water in barrels, secured the barn, and moved essential supplies into the house. "If they come," Jedediah explained as they worked, "we need to be able to hold out. Make it too costly for them to continue." Ruth understood the unspoken reality. They were preparing for a siege, perhaps even a battle. The thought terrified her, but she worked alongside Jedediah without complaint. What choice did she have? As evening approached, Jedediah built a fire on the hearth. The days were warm, but desert nights brought a chill that seeped into the bones. They sat before the flames, eating a simple meal of beans and cornbread. "Why are you doing this?" Ruth asked suddenly. "Risking your life for a stranger." Jedediah stared into the fire, the light casting deep shadows across his weathered face. "After the war," he said slowly, I wandered. Couldn't go home, there was nothing left. Couldn't practice medicine anymore. My hands shook too badly. He held up his right hand, which was indeed trembling slightly. Saw too much death, I suppose. He fell silent, and Ruth thought he might not continue. Then he spoke again, his voice lower. I came out here to die, if I'm honest. Bought this place with what money I had left. Planned to drink myself to death in peace. A humorless smile touched his lips. But it seems God had other plans. Ezekiel found me half dead from whiskey and grief, reminded me that my skills could still serve a purpose. You helped the freedmen, Ruth guessed. Jedediah nodded. Medical care, education when I could, small things, nothing that would make up for. He gestured vaguely, encompassing all the losses, all the failures. But it was something, a reason to wake up each day. He looked at her directly. So, to answer your question, I'm helping you because it's what I do now. Try to balance the scales in some small way. Ruth absorbed his words, turning them over in her mind. I was taught that Northerners were godless invaders, she said finally. That abolitionists wanted to destroy our way of life out of spite or ignorance. And I was taught that all Southerners were cruel slaveholders, Jedediah countered. That they cared more for cotton than human dignity. He shook his head. The war taught me that people are rarely as simple as our stories about them. Ruth thought of Clayton, a Southerner who had switched sides for power, who used his authority to victimize the vulnerable, and of Jedediah, a Northerner who had tried to save lives regardless of uniform, who now risked himself to protect her. I think I'm beginning to understand that, she said. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Ruth found herself studying Jedediah's profile, noting the strength that remained despite his years and sorrows. He was not a handsome man in the conventional sense, but there was a dignity to him, a steadfastness that she found comforting. May I ask you something personal? She ventured. Jedediah glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. You may ask. I may not answer. Fair enough, Ruth said. During your nightmares, yes. I heard them last night. You called out a name. Mason. Who is he? A shadow crossed Jedediah's face, his jaw tightening. For a moment, Ruth thought he would refuse to answer. When he spoke, his voice was tight with suppressed emotion. Captain Mason Wells, Confederate officer. He stared into the fire. I was the surgeon assigned to a field hospital after Antietam. Wells' son was brought in, young lieutenant, no more than 20, got shot. Jedediah's hands clenched into fists. I operated, but the damage was too extensive. He died on my table. Ruth nodded slowly. And the father blamed you? No, Jedediah hesitated. It's more complicated than that. Mason Wells was captured shortly after, brought to the same camp where I was stationed. When he learned I had treated his son, he thanked me, said at least the boy hadn't died alone in the mud. This wasn't what Ruth had expected. Then why does he haunt your dreams? Jedediah's expression darkened. Because later I made a mistake. A terrible mistake that cost many lives, including men under Wells's command. He rose abruptly. I don't wish to speak of it further. Ruth recognized the finality in his tone. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to bring up painful memories. We all have ghosts, Ruth, Jedediah said, his voice softening slightly. Some are just louder than others. He moved toward the stairs. Get some rest. Tomorrow we continue preparations. As he climbed the stairs to the loft, Ruth remained by the fire, thinking about the man who had saved her. A Union surgeon haunted by the lives he couldn't save. A husband and father who had lost everything. A man trying to atone for mistakes he couldn't forgive himself for making. She thought of her own ghosts, Thomas, who had marched away to war with such conviction never to return. Her mother, who had taught her that a lady's greatest virtues were modesty and obedience. The woman she had been before Clayton's violence had stripped away her sense of safety of self. The fire burned lower, the flames casting dancing shadows across the walls. Ruth pulled her small Bible from her pocket, running her fingers over its worn cover. Inside, along with Thomas's inscription, was a pressed flower, a small yellow primrose he had given her the day he left for war. "Guide me," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to God, to Thomas, or to some part of herself that still believed in purpose and meaning. No answer came save for the crackling of the dying fire and the distant howl of a coyote on the plains. But as Ruth closed the Bible and prepared for sleep, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. Whatever came, she would face it with as much courage as she could muster, and she would not face it alone. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the sun rising over the eastern plains in a blaze of orange and gold. Ruth emerged from the bedroom to find Jedediah already awake, a cup of coffee in hand, staring out the window. "You're up early," she observed, moving to pour herself a cup. "Oh, couldn't sleep," he replied. "Too much on my mind." Ruth joined him at the window. From this vantage point, they could see for miles across the flat landscape a tactical advantage, but also a reminder of how exposed they were. Nowhere to hide if Clayton and his men came in force. "We should continue your shooting practice," Jedediah said after a moment, "and I want to show you something else." After a quick breakfast, they moved outside. The morning air was still cool, but Ruth could feel the promise of heat in the strengthening sun. Jedediah led her not to their makeshift shooting range, but to a spot behind the barn where the ground appeared slightly different, harder packed with subtle depressions. "What is this?" Ruth asked. Jedediah knelt, brushing away loose soil to reveal a wooden handle embedded in the ground. "Insurance," he said, pulling on the handle. A trapdoor lifted, revealing a set of wooden steps descending into darkness. Ruth stepped back in surprise. "A cellar. More than that," Jedediah said, reaching into the opening to light a lantern that hung just inside. "Come, see for yourself." Ruth followed him down the steps, the air growing cooler as they descended. The lantern illuminated a space much larger than she had expected, a room perhaps 15 feet square, its walls and ceiling reinforced with timber. Shelves lined one wall, stocked with preserved food-water barrels, blankets, and other supplies. Another wall held more medical supplies than Ruth had ever seen outside a proper hospital. But it was the third wall that caught her attention. There, carefully arranged, were several rifles boxes of ammunition and what appeared to be military equipment. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice hushed in the confined space. "During the war, this was a stop on the Underground Railroad," Jedediah explained, "a place where escaped slaves could rest safely before continuing north. After the war, when I bought the property, I maintained it, just in case." "In case of what?" Jedediah's expression was grim. "In case men like Clayton decided the war wasn't really over." Ruth moved around the room, taking in the supplies, the careful organization. "You've been preparing for this for years," she realized. "Not for this specifically," Jedediah corrected, "but for something. The war changed things, but it didn't change people. Not really." He gestured to the room. "If they come in force, we retreat here. It's defensible, stocked for several days." Ruth nodded, understanding the strategy, but a deeper question nagged at her. "Why show me this? You've kept it secret for years. Why trust me with it now?" Jedediah studied her for a long moment. "Because you need to know all your options," he said finally. "And because I think you understand what it means to fight for survival." They emerged from the hidden room, Jedediah carefully concealing the entrance once more. As they walked back toward the house, Ruth felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude for Jedediah's trust, fear of what might be coming, and a growing determination to survive whatever the cost. The day passed in continued preparation. Jedediah taught Ruth more about shooting, focusing now on accuracy under pressure. "Don't think about the target as a bottle," he instructed. "Think of it as a threat, someone coming to hurt you." Ruth raised the rifle sighting along the barrel. In her mind's eye, the bottle transformed into Clayton's leering face. She squeezed the trigger, and the bottle shattered. "Good," Jedediah said, approval in his voice. "Again." By midday, Ruth's arms ached, and her head throbbed from the constant gunfire. But her accuracy had improved dramatically, and with it, her confidence. "Enough for now," Jedediah said, noting her fatigue. "We'll continue later." They returned to the house, where Jedediah prepared a simple meal. As they ate, Ruth found herself studying him openly, curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. "You mentioned your wife and daughter," she said carefully. "Would you tell me about them, if it's not too painful?" Jedediah paused his fork halfway to his mouth. For a moment, Ruth thought she had overstepped again. Then he set the fork down and leaned back in his chair. "Hannah was a schoolteacher," he said, his voice soft with memory. "Smartest woman I ever knew. Could recite Shakespeare and calculate complex mathematics with equal ease." A faint smile touched his lips. "She had no patience for fools or liars, but infinite patience for children and the elderly." Ruth smiled, picturing this formidable woman. "And your daughter, Sarah," Jedediah said the name almost a caress. "She was 8 when it happened. Had her mother's intelligence and her father's stubbornness." His eyes grew distant. "She collected wildflowers, knew the name of every one, wanted to be a doctor like me." Ruth felt a pang of sympathy so acute it was almost physical. "They sound wonderful." "They were," Jedediah agreed. His expression darkened. "They deserved better than what happened to them." "The fire," Ruth said. "You mentioned retribution for your Union sympathies." Jedediah nodded, his jaw tight. "We lived in eastern Tennessee, divided region, some for the Union, some for the Confederacy. When I joined the Union Army as a surgeon, I made enemies among our neighbors." He looked down at his hands. "I was at a field hospital near Chattanooga when it happened. Didn't learn of it until weeks later." "I'm so sorry," Ruth said softly. "What about you?" Jedediah asked, clearly wanting to shift the focus. "Tell me about Thomas. How did you meet?" Ruth welcomed the change of subject. "We grew up together," she said, "in Oak Ridge. His family owned the land next to ours. We were childhood friends before we were sweethearts." She smiled at the memory. "He used to pull my braids in school. Said it was because he liked my hair, but was too shy to say so properly." "And you married young—" "Just before the war," Ruth confirmed. "I was 17, he was 20. Everyone said we were rushing, but we knew what we wanted." Her smile faded. "We had less than a year together before he left for the war." "That must have been difficult," Jedediah said, his tone sympathetic. "It was," Ruth agreed. "But I had faith he would return. I prayed every night." She touched her Bible, which she now kept in her pocket at all times. "When the news came that he had fallen at Gettysburg once, I couldn't believe it. Kept expecting him to walk through the door full of stories about the great adventure he'd had." Jedediah nodded in understanding. "Grief makes ghosts of the living and dreams of the dead." "Yes," Ruth whispered. "Exactly that." They lapsed into silence, each lost in memories of loved ones long gone. The quiet was comfortable now, a shared understanding between two people who had known profound loss. The moment was shattered by the sound of a horse approaching at speed. Jedediah was on his feet in an instant, moving to the window. "Ezekiel," he said, relief evident in his voice, "but he's riding hard. Something's wrong." They hurried outside. Ezekiel reined his mule to a stop, dismounting with unusual haste for a man his age. His face was drawn with urgency. "They're coming," he said without preamble. "Clayton and his men. At least a dozen, maybe more." Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. "How soon?" "Tomorrow at dawn," Ezekiel said. "They've been gathering supplies, weapons. They're not coming to arrest you, Ruth. They're coming to make an example." Jedediah's expression hardened. "Are you certain of this?" Ezekiel nodded grimly. "Overheard Clayton himself talking to his lieutenants. He knows she's here, Jed. Someone must have seen you at the church or on the ride back." "Or guessed," Jedediah said. "I've made no secret of my sympathies over the years." He turned to Ruth. "We need to decide quickly. Stay and fight, or try to run." Ruth looked between the two men, her mind racing. "If we run, where would we go? They know the territory better than I do." "There's a Union garrison at Fort Richardson," Ezekiel suggested. 60 miles north. You might find protection there." 60 miles, Jedediah repeated. "Across open country with Clayton's men likely watching the roads. It's a risk." "As is staying," Ruth pointed out. "We're outnumbered." Jedediah nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. "The cellar gives us an advantage. They won't know about it. We could hold out there, wait for them to tire of the siege." "Or they could burn the house down around us," Ezekiel countered. "Clayton's not known for his patience or mercy." Ruth closed her eyes, trying to think clearly through the fear. Images flashed through her mind. Clayton's face twisted with rage, the abandoned church where she had first met Jedediah Thomas, marching away to war, never to return. When she opened her eyes, both men were watching her, waiting for her decision. It struck her then that this was perhaps the first time in her life that men were deferring to her judgment. Not out of politeness or condescension, but out of genuine respect for her right to choose her own fate. "We stay," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "We prepare, and if they come, we fight." Jedediah nodded, a look of approval crossing his weathered features. "Then we'd best get ready." Ezekiel shook his head. "You're both damn fools," he said, but there was a grudging respect in his tone. "I'd stay and help, but—" "No," Jedediah interrupted. "You need to return. If anyone suspects you warned us, you'd be in danger too." "I'm an old man," Ezekiel said. "Lived through slavery, war, and Reconstruction. Not much left to fear." "Nevertheless," Jedediah insisted, "your people need you, and we may need you after if things go poorly." Ezekiel sighed, clearly unhappy, but recognizing the wisdom in Jedediah's words. "Very well, but I'll be nearby, just in case." He embraced Jedediah briefly, then turned to Ruth. "You're braver than you know, child," he said, his voice gentle. "May God watch over you both." After Ezekiel departed, Jedediah and Ruth worked with renewed urgency, moving essential supplies to the cellar, securing the house as best they could. As evening fell, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold. "It's beautiful," Ruth said softly. "Even now, with everything, it's still beautiful." Jedediah nodded, his profile outlined against the fading light. "That's how life works," he said. "Beauty and terror side by side. always has been. Ruth drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the evening air cooled. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Not just of dying, of what might happen before death." Jedediah's expression darkened. "I won't let them take you alive," he said, his voice low and fierce. "If it comes to that, I promise you a quick end." Ruth nodded, understanding the grim mercy in his words. "Thank you." They sat in silence as the stars emerged brilliant pinpoints in the vast Texas sky. Despite the fear, the uncertainty of what morning would bring, Ruth felt an odd sense of peace. She had made her choice. She would stand her ground, fight for her life and her dignity. Whatever happened, she would face it with courage. And she would not face it alone. Later, as Ruth prepared for what might be her last night of peaceful sleep, she heard Jedediah moving about in the main room. Curious, she opened her door a crack. He sat at the table writing by candlelight, as she had seen him do before. But this time, she could see his face clearly lined with worry. Yes, but also with a strange kind of acceptance. As she watched, he finished writing and sealed the letter in an envelope. But instead of adding it to the stacks on the shelves, he placed it in a small wooden box along with several other items. His pocket watch, a small daguerreotype she assumed was of his family, and a folded document that looked official. Ruth quietly closed her door, not wanting to intrude on this private moment. But she understood what she had witnessed, a man putting his affairs in order, preparing for the possibility that tomorrow might be his last day on earth. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Ruth found herself doing the same, mentally cataloging her few possessions, considering what legacy, if any, she would leave behind. It was a sobering exercise, but not as frightening as she might have expected. "Thomas," she whispered into the darkness, "if I join you tomorrow, I hope you'll be proud of how I faced the end." She closed her eyes, her hand resting on the small Bible in her pocket, and waited for sleep to come. Outside, a coyote howled long and mournful, as though lamenting what the dawn might bring. Dawn broke like a fever, hot and unforgiving, across the Texas plains. Light crept into the bedroom where Ruth lay not in sleep, but in the strange limbo between wakefulness and dreams. She had dozed fitfully through the night ears, straining for the approach of horses, of men, of death itself. The silence was almost worse than noise would have been. It stretched moment by moment into a taut wire of anticipation. Ruth rose, smoothing her wrinkled dress, the same one she had worn for days now, and ran fingers through her tangled hair. Such small vanities seemed both foolish and desperately important this morning. If she were to die today, she would at least face her end with dignity. In the main room, Jedediah stood by the window, rifle in hand, watching the eastern horizon. He glanced back as she entered, his expression somber but calm. "Nothing yet," he said. Ruth moved to stand beside him, gazing out at the vast landscape bathed in golden morning light. The beauty of it caught in her throat. "It's so peaceful," she whispered. Jedediah nodded. "Nature doesn't concern itself with human conflicts." They stood in silence for a moment, side by side, watching the sun climb higher. Then Jedediah turned away, gesturing to the table where he had laid out a simple breakfast, cornbread, dried beef, coffee. "Eat," he said. "We need to keep our strength." They ate without speaking, the quiet broken only by the sounds of their meal and the occasional call of birds outside. It was a strange sort of peace suspended between what had been and what might come. Ruth found herself studying Jedediah's face, memorizing the lines and angles of it the way the morning light caught in his pale eyes. "What?" he asked, noticing her gaze. "Just thinking," Ruth replied, "about how strange life is. A week ago, I didn't know you existed. Now we might die together." Jedediah finished for her, his voice matter of fact. Ruth nodded. Yes, and yet I'm glad I met you. Even with— She gestured vaguely, encompassing their precarious situation. A ghost of a smile touched Jedediah's lips. I understand. After breakfast, they moved with practiced efficiency, checking weapons, securing the house, making final preparations. Jedediah insisted they move most of their supplies to the cellar, preparing for the possibility of a siege. If they come in force, he explained, we won't be able to hold the house. We'll retreat to the cellar, seal the entrance. And then what? Ruth asked. Jedediah's expression was grim. And then we wait, for them to leave, or for help to come. You don't think they'll leave, Ruth observed. No, he admitted. Not without what they came for. The morning stretched on the sun climbing higher, beating down on the weathered boards of the house. Still no sign of riders on the horizon. The waiting began to fray Ruth's nerves, making her jump at every creak of the old house, every rustle of wind through the grass. Perhaps Ezekiel was wrong, she suggested as midday approached. Perhaps they're not coming today. Jedediah shook his head. They're coming. They're just being careful, probably scouting the approach, looking for the best angle of attack. His calm certainty was oddly reassuring. Ruth moved to the shelf, where Jedediah kept his books, running her fingers along the spines. So many medical texts, histories, and Bibles. A life of learning and faith despite, or perhaps because of the tragedies he had endured. She selected one of the Bibles different from the others, smaller, bound in worn red leather, a woman's Bible. Opening it, she found an inscription, "To Hannah, my beloved wife. May God's word bring you comfort in times of darkness. With eternal love, Jedediah." That was hers, Jedediah said from behind her, making Ruth start. She hadn't heard him approach. I'm sorry, she said, closing the Bible quickly. I shouldn't have. It's all right, Jedediah interrupted. She would have liked you, I think. Hannah had a strong sense of justice and little patience for men who abused their power. Ruth carefully returned the Bible to its place on the shelf. You must miss them terribly. Every day, Jedediah acknowledged. But the sharpness fades with time. The grief remains, but it changes, becomes something you can carry without being crushed by it. Ruth thought of Thomas, of the acute pain that had eventually mellowed into a constant dull ache. Yes, she said softly. It does. A sound from outside broke the moment, the distant but unmistakable rhythm of hoofbeats. Jedediah moved swiftly to the window, rifle ready. Riders, he confirmed, his voice tense. At least a dozen coming from the east. Ruth felt her heart accelerate, her mouth suddenly dry. This was it then, the moment they had been preparing for. What do we do? She asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Get your rifle, Jedediah instructed. Take position at the north window. I'll cover the east. Don't fire until I give the word. Ruth nodded, retrieving the rifle he had given her. It felt heavier now, the weight of potential death in her hands. She moved to the designated window, positioning herself so she could see out while remaining mostly hidden from view. The riders were closer now, a dark line against the golden grass. Through the wavering heat, Ruth could make out details, men on horseback, rifles gleaming in the sunlight. At their head rode a figure she recognized even at this distance, Clayton Hargrove, his posture as arrogant on horseback as it had been in her bedroom. I see Clayton, she called to Jedediah, who had taken position at the other window. Yes, he replied grimly. And he's brought friends. The riders approached with caution, spreading out to surround the house from a distance. They halted about 200 yards away, too far for accurate rifle fire from either side, but close enough for their intentions to be clear. Jedediah Foster, Clayton's voice carried across the open ground, powerful and commanding. "We know you're harboring a fugitive. Send out Ruth Abernathy, and you won't be harmed." Jedediah and Ruth exchanged glances. They had anticipated this, the pretense of legal authority, the false promise of mercy. "What do you want with Mrs. Abernathy?" Jedediah called back, his voice equally strong. "She's wanted for the attempted murder of an officer of the law," Clayton shouted. "She'll receive a fair trial in Oak Ridge." Ruth felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat. Fair trial. As if anything about Clayton's justice was fair. "She defended herself against assault," Jedediah responded. "Against you, Clayton Hargrove. There's nothing lawful about what you're doing." A murmur ran through the mounted men at this accusation. Ruth watched with interest. Not all of them seemed entirely comfortable with the situation. Perhaps some had been told a different story about why they were here. Clayton's face darkened even at this distance. "That's a damnable lie," he shouted. "She's turned your head with her feminine wiles, old man. Don't throw your life away for a murderous whore." The crude words struck Ruth like physical blows. She tightened her grip on the rifle, anger rising hot in her chest. "Don't let him provoke you," Jedediah said quietly, noticing her reaction. "That's what he wants." Clayton waited a moment, then called again. "This is your last chance, Foster. Send her out now, or we're coming in to get her." "He's lying," Ruth said. "They'll kill us both regardless." Jedediah nodded grimly. "I know. Get ready to move to the cellar. When the shooting starts, we'll hold them off as long as we can from here, then fall back." Ruth's mouth was dry with fear, but she nodded. The plan was simple, their options limited. They would fight, and if God was merciful, they might survive. Outside, Clayton had apparently tired of waiting. He raised his arm, signaling to his men. They began to spread out further, taking positions behind whatever meager cover the landscape offered. A few scattered boulders, depressions in the ground, the lone oak tree that stood sentinel near the barn. "They're getting ready to rush us," Jedediah observed. "Remember your training. Aim carefully. Make each shot count." Ruth nodded, sighting along her rifle at the nearest rider. Her hands were steady now, the fear transmuted into a strange cold clarity. She thought of Clayton's hands on her, his weight pressing her down, his breath hot against her neck. The memory steeled her resolve. "Jedediah," she said quietly, "if I don't survive this, you will—" He interrupted. "But if I don't," she insisted, "I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything." Jedediah glanced at her, something softening in his weathered face. "As am I," he said simply. Outside, Clayton raised his arm again, preparing to give the signal to attack. The moment stretched taut with anticipation. Then something unexpected happened. One of the riders, a tall man with a gray beard, broke from the group, urging his horse forward a few paces. He said something to Clayton too low for Ruth to hear. Clayton turned in his saddle, his posture radiating anger. The two men appeared to argue briefly. "What's happening?" Ruth asked, not daring to take her eyes off the scene. "Not sure," Jedediah replied. "Seems there's a disagreement among our visitors." The argument outside intensified. Other riders began to join in, some apparently siding with the gray-bearded man, others with Clayton. The united front was fracturing before their eyes. Finally, Clayton turned his horse back toward the house. "Foster!" he called, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "I want to speak with you face to face." Jedediah and Ruth exchanged surprised glances. "It's a trap," Ruth whispered. "Possibly," Jedediah agreed. "But something's changed out there. They're divided about something." "You can't seriously be considering going out there," Ruth said, alarm rising in her voice. Jedediah's expression was thoughtful. If they wanted to simply kill us, they could have attacked already. They have the numbers. What then? I don't know, Jedediah admitted. But I intend to find out. He moved away from the window, checking his revolver before tucking it into his belt. You're going out there? Ruth asked incredulously. Yes, you stay here, keep your rifle trained on Clayton. If anything happens to me, retreat to the cellar immediately. Jedediah, no. It's our best chance, Ruth, he said, his tone allowing no argument. Something's changed the dynamic out there. We need to understand what it is. Before she could protest further, Jedediah moved to the door. He opened it slowly, stepping onto the porch, with deliberate movements, his hands visible and empty. I'm here, Clayton, he called. What do you want to discuss? Clayton urged his horse forward, stopping about 50 yards from the house, close enough for conversation, but still beyond effective revolver range. The gray-bearded man who had argued with him followed along with two others. The rest of the riders remained in their positions watching. You're making a mistake, Foster, Clayton called. Harboring a dangerous criminal. It's not too late to reconsider. The only criminal I see is you, Hargrove, Jedediah replied evenly. Using your badge to terrorize a widow. Gathering armed men to attack an isolated homestead. Tell me, do your friends here know the real reason Mrs. Abernathy stabbed you? A murmur ran through the men behind Clayton. The gray-bearded man leaned forward in his saddle, saying something that made Clayton's face darken with fury. Lies, Clayton spat. She's filled your head with lies, old man. I was a surgeon. Jedediah continued, his voice carrying clearly across the open ground. I've seen enough wounds to know the difference between an attack and a defense. Mrs. Abernathy was defending herself against assault. Your assault. The gray-bearded man turned to Clayton, his expression demanding explanation. Clayton's hand moved toward his holstered pistol. Be careful, Mr. Foster, Ruth whispered from her position at the window rifle trained on Clayton's chest. Her finger hovered near the trigger, ready. Outside, the confrontation continued. Clayton's face was flushed with rage, his control slipping. Enough talk, he shouted. We're taking the woman. Foster, stand aside or die with her. There are ladies present in Oak Ridge who would testify to your character, Clayton. Jedediah said, his voice still calm. Widows like Mrs. Abernathy, who've suffered your protection. How many, I wonder? How many have you forced yourself on using your badge as a weapon? The gray-bearded man's expression changed, his gaze, moving from Clayton to Jedediah and back again. He said something to the men beside him, who nodded slowly. Clayton saw it happening, the erosion of his authority, the questioning glances, his face contorted with rage. Shoot him, he ordered the men nearest him, but no one moved. The gray-bearded man shook his head slowly. We came for justice, Clayton, he said, his voice carrying clearly now. Not to murder an old man based on your word alone. Clayton's control snapped. With a curse, he drew his pistol, aiming at Jedediah. I'll do it myself, then. Ruth's rifle cracked, the sound deafening in the still air. Clayton's horse reared, startled by the sound and the bullet that kicked up dust inches from its hooves. Clayton struggled to maintain control, his shot going wild well over Jedediah's head. Chaos erupted. Some of Clayton's men drew weapons, others tried to calm their frightened horses. The gray-bearded man shouted orders, trying to restore order. Jedediah took advantage of the confusion to retreat to the porch, ducking inside the house, where Ruth waited, her rifle reloaded and ready. That was too close, she said, her voice shaking with adrenaline. But informative, Jedediah replied. They're not as united as Clayton would like. The older man, that's Samuel Thornton, former Confederate officer respected in the county. He's questioning Clayton's version of events. Will it be enough? Ruth asked, peering out the window at the milling riders. "I don't know," Jedediah admitted. "But it's bought us time." Outside, the confrontation between Clayton and Thornton continued, their voices occasionally rising enough to be heard inside the house. "Not what you told us, lying whore. Sworn on the Bible." The argument continued for several minutes, the other riders watching in uncomfortable silence. Finally, Thornton turned his horse, gesturing to several of the men. To Ruth's surprise, they began to withdraw, riding slowly back the way they had come. "They're leaving," she breathed, hardly daring to believe it. "Some of them," Jedediah corrected. "Not all, and not Clayton." Indeed, while perhaps half the riders followed Thornton, the rest remained with Clayton, who watched the departing men with naked fury on his face. When they were some distance away, he turned back to the house. "This changes nothing, Foster," he shouted. "We'll still take her." Jedediah returned to the door. "Your position is weaker now, Clayton," he called back. "Half your men have abandoned you. Take what's left and go before more blood is shed." Clayton's laugh was ugly. "I still have enough men to burn you out, old man. We'll wait until nightfall. See how brave you are when this house is in flames around you." With that, he wheeled his horse around, gesturing for his remaining men to follow. They withdrew to the edge of the property, taking positions behind what little cover the landscape offered, preparing to wait. Ruth and Jedediah watched them go, the temporary relief giving way to renewed tension. "What now?" Ruth asked. "Now we prepare for nightfall," Jedediah replied grimly. He wasn't bluffing about burning us out. It's what I would do in his position. They spent the afternoon making final preparations, moving everything essential to the cellar, creating barriers within the house that might slow the advance of flames. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the plains, Ruth found herself drawn to the porch, gazing out at the beauty of the Texas sunset. Jedediah joined her, his rifle propped against the wall within easy reach. For a long moment, they stood in silence, watching the sky transform from blue to gold to deepening crimson. "It's strange," Ruth said finally, "how beautiful the world can be, even when people are so cruel." Jedediah nodded, his weathered face softened by the evening light. "I've thought the same many times, on battlefields, in field hospitals. The sun still rises and sets. The stars still come out. Nature is indifferent to our struggles." "Is that comforting or terrifying?" Ruth wondered aloud. "Both, I think," Jedediah replied. "It reminds us of our insignificance, but also of the constancy of creation. No matter what happens here tonight, the sun will rise tomorrow." Ruth nodded, finding an odd peace in the thought. "When I was a girl," she said, "my mother taught me that God counts every sparrow that falls, that nothing happens without his knowledge." "You still believe that?" Jedediah asked, no judgment in his tone. Ruth considered the question seriously. "I don't know," she admitted. "After Thomas died, after what Clayton did to me, it's hard to believe in a God who watches so closely, yet allows such suffering." Jedediah was silent for a moment. "I've struggled with the same questions," he said finally. "After Hannah and Sarah died, I cursed God, cursed him for taking them, for sparing me, for making me live without them." "What changed?" Ruth asked, sensing there was more to the story. Jedediah gazed out at the darkening landscape. "I met Ezekiel," he said. "He'd suffered more than I could imagine slavery, the loss of his family, hatred and violence at every turn. Yet he still believed. Not in a God who controls everything, but in a God who suffers with us, who weeps when we weep." Ruth pondered this. "That's not what I was taught in church. Nor I, Jedediah agreed. But it's the only faith that makes sense to me now. A God who doesn't prevent suffering, but who is present within it, who works through people like Ezekiel, he hesitated. Like you, Ruth. Ruth looked at him in surprise. Me, your courage, Jedediah explained. Your resilience, your capacity for compassion, even after all you've endured. If there is divine presence in this world, surely it manifests in such qualities. Ruth felt something warm unfurl in her chest, not romantic love, but a deeper connection, a recognition of shared humanity in the face of suffering. Before she could respond, however, movement in the distance caught her eye. "Jedediah," she said urgently. "Look!" Clayton and his men were on the move, splitting into smaller groups approaching the house from multiple angles. The fading light glinted off weapons and, more ominously, off what appeared to be containers of liquid. "Oil," Jedediah said grimly. "For the fire. They're coming now, while there's still light enough to see." He picked up his rifle. "Time to move to the cellar." They retreated inside Jedediah, pausing only to collect a few final items. His medical bag, Hannah's Bible, the wooden box Ruth had seen him prepare the night before. Together, they moved to the concealed trapdoor behind the barn, slipping down into the cellar, just as the first shots rang out. The underground room was cool and dim, lit only by a single lantern that Jedediah had placed there earlier. Ruth could hear the muffled sounds of men shouting of boots on the hard-packed earth above them. The cellar door was well hidden, but if Clayton's men searched thoroughly enough, they would find it eventually. "What now?" Ruth whispered, the close confines of the cellar making even a normal voice seem too loud. "We wait," Jedediah replied, checking his revolver. "Listen!" Above them, the sounds of destruction grew louder, breaking glass, splintering wood. Then came a new sound, a roar that Ruth recognized with primal fire. Clayton's men had set the house ablaze. "They're burning it," she breathed, horrified, despite having expected this very outcome. Jedediah nodded grimly. "They'll watch it burn, make sure no one escapes. Then they'll search the property more thoroughly." "How long do we have?" "Not long," Jedediah admitted. "The house will burn quickly in this dry weather. Once it's gone, they'll focus on the barn, then the surrounding area." Ruth felt claustrophobia threatening to overwhelm her. They were trapped underground with fire above and armed men searching for them. It seemed there was no escape. "We should have run when we had the chance," she whispered. Jedediah shook his head. "They would have caught us in the open. At least here we have a chance." "What chance?" Ruth demanded, fear making her voice sharp. "We're trapped, Jedediah." He placed a hand on her arm, his touch steady and reassuring. "Not necessarily," he said. "The cellar has another exit." Ruth stared at him in surprise. "What? Where?" Jedediah moved to a stack of crates in the corner, shifting them to reveal a narrow tunnel. "It leads out to the creek bed about a quarter-mile east," he explained. "It was used during the war to help escaped slaves avoid patrols." Hope flared in Ruth's chest, but quickly dimmed. "They'll have men watching in that direction," she pointed out. "Likely," Jedediah agreed. "But it's night now and getting darker. The fire will draw their attention, ruin their night vision. If we're careful, we might slip past them." It was a slim chance, but better than waiting to be discovered. Ruth nodded. "When do we go?" "Not yet," Jedediah said. "We need to wait until the house is fully engulfed. That's when they'll be most distracted." So they waited, listening to the sounds of destruction above them. The roar of the fire grew louder, and Ruth imagined the house, Jedediah's home, filled with his books and letters, and memories being consumed by flames. A wave of sorrow washed over her. "Your home," she said softly. All your things. Jedediah's expression was stoic. Just things, he said. The memories remain. He patted the wooden box beside him. And I have what matters most right here. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The fire above must have spread to the barn. Now they could hear the timbers creaking and cracking as the structure began to collapse. The heat was penetrating even into the cellar, making the air stifling. It's time, Jedediah said finally. The fire will be at its height now. All eyes will be on it. He extinguished their lantern, plunging the cellar into darkness. Ruth felt his hand find hers, guiding her toward the tunnel entrance. Stay close, he whispered. The tunnel is narrow and low in places. We'll need to crawl part of the way. Ruth nodded, though he couldn't see it in the darkness. She followed him into the tunnel, the earthen walls pressing in on either side. The air was thick with dust and the distant smell of smoke. In places, the ceiling was so low they had to crawl on hands and knees, the rough ground scraping Ruth's palms. They moved slowly, carefully aware that any sound might betray them to the men above. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning through the earth. Ruth lost all sense of direction, following blindly, trusting Jedediah to lead them to safety. Finally, she felt a change in the air, cooler, fresher. Jedediah paused, and she nearly bumped into him in the darkness. We're almost at the exit, he whispered, his voice barely audible. From here, we'll be able to see if the creek bed is clear. He moved forward again, more cautiously now. Ruth followed, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain anyone nearby would hear it. The tunnel began to slope upward, and ahead she could see a faint lightening of the darkness, starlight filtering through some kind of covering. Jedediah stopped just short of the exit, listening intently. Ruth held her breath, straining to hear any sound of their pursuers. For a long moment, there was only silence, broken occasionally by the distant crackle of the fire they had left behind. I'll go first, Jedediah whispered. If it's clear, I'll signal. If not, he hesitated. If not, stay hidden and wait for a better opportunity. Before Ruth could protest, he moved forward, pushing aside what appeared to be a carefully arranged pile of brush that concealed the tunnel entrance. He disappeared from view, leaving Ruth alone in the darkness. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one an eternity of fear and anticipation. Had he been captured? Shot? Was he lying dead just outside while Clayton's men waited for her to emerge? Just as Ruth was considering whether to advance or retreat, Jedediah's face reappeared at the entrance, silhouetted against the night sky. Clear, he whispered. Hurry. Ruth scrambled forward, emerging from the tunnel into the cool night air. They were in a dry creek bed, its banks high enough to shield them from view. Above, the stars wheeled in their eternal patterns, indifferent to the drama playing out beneath them. In the distance, an orange glow lit the horizon, Jedediah's home still burning. The sight sent a pang through Ruth's heart. All of this destruction, this danger because of her. I'm sorry, she whispered. Jedediah shook his head. Don't, he said simply. This isn't your doing. He helped her to her feet, and together they began to move along the creek bed, staying low, using the banks for cover. Their goal, Jedediah had explained, was to reach a stand of trees about a mile away, where they might find better concealment. They had gone perhaps half that distance when a sound froze them in place. Voices approaching from the direction they were headed. Men on foot moving along the creek bed. Back? Jedediah mouthed, gesturing for Ruth to retreat, but it was too late. From behind them came another sound, horses moving parallel to the creek. They were being flanked, caught between two groups of pursuers. There! A voice shouted. In the creek bed, a rifle cracked the bullet, striking the bank near Ruth's head, showering her with dirt and small stones. Jedediah grabbed her arm, pulling her behind a small outcropping of rock, minimal cover, but better than nothing. "Run," he urged, drawing his revolver. "I'll hold them off." "No," Ruth protested. "I won't leave you." "You must," Jedediah insisted. "One of us should survive to tell the truth about Clayton." Before Ruth could argue further, more shots rang out. Jedediah returned fire, the revolver loud in the confined space of the creek bed. From their position, Ruth could see the approaching men, 3 of them moving cautiously now that they knew their quarry was armed. "Go, Ruth!" Jedediah said again, his voice urgent. "Please." Ruth hesitated, torn between flight and loyalty. Then, movement on the bank above caught her eye, a 4th man approaching from behind. Rifle raised and aimed at Jedediah's back. "Jedediah!" she cried, raising her own revolver. She fired without conscious thought, the weapon bucking in her hand. The man on the bank staggered, clutching his shoulder, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the air as he fell. The shot revealed Ruth's position, drawing fire from the men in the creek bed. Bullets whined past her, striking the ground and the rocks around her. Jedediah fired again, and one of the approaching men fell with a cry of pain. But they were still outnumbered, and more men would be coming, drawn by the sound of gunfire. Ruth knew they couldn't win this fight, not here, not now. "Jedediah," she said urgently, "we need to move. Together." He glanced at her, something like pride flickering in his pale eyes. Then he nodded. "Together, then, on my signal run for those trees." He gestured to a small clump of cottonwoods about 50 yards downstream. Ruth nodded, gathering herself for the sprint. Jedediah fired twice more in quick succession, forcing their pursuers to take cover. "Now!" he shouted. They ran, abandoning the meager shelter of the rocks, racing toward the trees with desperate speed. Bullets kicked up dust around them, but the darkness and their pursuers' haste made accurate shooting difficult. They were halfway to the trees when Ruth heard Jedediah grunt in pain beside her. He stumbled, but kept running, his right arm hanging awkwardly at his side. "You're hit," she gasped. "Keep moving," he gritted out. They reached the trees, ducking behind the largest trunk. Only then did Ruth see the extent of Jedediah's injury. A bullet had torn through his upper arm, the sleeve of his shirt, dark with blood. "Let me see," she insisted, tearing a strip from her petticoat to use as a bandage. "No time," Jedediah said, though he allowed her to bind the wound quickly. "They'll surround us soon. We need to keep moving." But where could they go? The night was clear, the terrain open. Any movement would expose them to their pursuers, who were now spreading out, trying to encircle their position. "Jedediah," Ruth said, her voice low and urgent, "I should give myself up. It's me they want. You could still escape." "No," Jedediah said firmly. "Clayton would kill you, Ruth. You know that. And if we stay, he'll kill us both," she countered. Jedediah's face was pale in the starlight, drawn with pain, but resolute. "Then we make our stand here," he said, "and trust in God's mercy." Ruth nodded, accepting the inevitability of their situation. They had fought, they had fled, and now they were cornered. All that remained was to face their end with courage. She checked her revolver, 3 bullets remaining. Jedediah had 2 in his. 5 shots against at least half a dozen armed men. The odds were not in their favor. "Ruth," Jedediah said softly, "if it comes to the worst, I meant what I said before. I won't let them take you alive." Ruth met his gaze, understanding the grim promise. "Nor I you," she replied. A strange calm settled over her, then an acceptance of whatever might come. She thought of Thomas, of her parents, of all those who had gone before her into the mystery of death. Would she see them again? Was there truly a heaven where the weary found rest? In this moment on the edge of eternity, she found she believed there was. "They're coming," Jedediah whispered, breaking into her thoughts. Shadows moved in the darkness beyond their small sanctuary men, approaching cautiously aware of the armed resistance they had encountered. Ruth raised her revolver, sighting along the barrel at the nearest figure. Then, from somewhere to the east, a new sound erupted: gunfire, but not directed at them. Shouts of alarm rose from Clayton's men, followed by confusion and the thunder of retreating hoofbeats. "What's happening?" Ruth whispered. "I don't know," Jedediah replied, equally puzzled. They waited tense and ready as the sounds of conflict continued. Then a voice called out, familiar. "Welcome? Jed Ruth, are you there?" "Ezekiel," Jedediah called back cautiously. A figure emerged from the darkness, hands raised to show he was unarmed. It was indeed Ezekiel, his white beard gleaming in the starlight. "It's safe," he said, approaching their position. "Clayton and his men are retreating." "How?" Ruth asked, hardly daring to believe their sudden change in fortune. Ezekiel's smile was visible even in the dim light. "You weren't the only ones with friends, child. Thornton returned with reinforcements, men who believe in real justice, not Clayton's version of it." Relief flooded through Ruth, so intense it made her knees weak. They were saved. Somehow, against all odds, they were saved. "Jedediah's wounded," she told Ezekiel. "Shot in the arm." Ezekiel moved to examine the injury, his fingers gentle but knowing. "Clean through," he pronounced. "Missed the bone from the look of it. You're lucky, Jed." "Lucky?" Jedediah echoed, though his tone suggested he attributed their survival to something more than mere fortune. With Ezekiel's help, they made their way back across the creek bed and onto the plains beyond. A small group of riders waited there: Samuel Thornton and perhaps a dozen men, some of whom Ruth recognized from Oak Ridge. "Mrs. Abernathy," Thornton said, dismounting as they approached. "Mr. Foster, I owe you both an apology. I should never have ridden with Clayton in the first place." "What changed your mind?" Jedediah asked, leaning heavily on Ezekiel for support. "Several things," Thornton replied. "Your accusation about Clayton's treatment of widows. It matched rumors I'd heard but dismissed. And then, after we left, I spoke with some of the women in town. They confirmed everything." His weathered face hardened. No man who calls himself a gentleman could stand by after learning such things. "Where is Clayton now?" Ruth asked, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "Fled," Thornton said. "He and a few of his most loyal men. But they won't get far. I've sent riders to the Union garrison at Fort Richardson with sworn statements from his victims. His days as sheriff are over." Ruth felt a weight lift from her shoulders, not completely gone but lightened. Clayton would be pursued, would face justice for his crimes. She was no longer alone in her accusation. "Thank you," she said simply. Thornton nodded, then turned to Jedediah. "You're home, sir. I'm afraid there's nothing left. The fire took it all." Jedediah's expression remained stoic. "I expected as much," he said. "Buildings can be rebuilt." "And they will be," Thornton assured him. "You have my word on that. The community owes you a debt." One of the riders approached, leading 2 saddled horses. "For you and the lady," he explained. "We've got a camp set up about a mile west. Doctors waiting there for the wounded." As they prepared to mount, Ruth found herself standing close to Jedediah, their shoulders almost touching. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Jedediah looked out across the darkened plains toward where his home had stood. "We rebuild," he said simply. "We continue." Together. The question slipped out before Ruth could consider its implications. Jedediah turned to her, his pale eyes searching her face in the starlight. "If that's what you want," he said carefully. Ruth nodded. It wasn't a declaration of romantic love neither of them was ready for that might never be. But it was an acknowledgment of the bond that had formed between them, forged in fire and danger. "It is," she said. Something like a smile touched Jedediah's lips. "Then together it shall be." They mounted their horses, joining the small procession heading west across the plains. Behind them, the last embers of Jedediah's burning home winked out, leaving only darkness. But ahead, the stars continued their eternal dance, lighting their way toward whatever future awaited. As they rode, Ruth felt a strange peace settle over her. The danger wasn't entirely past. Clayton was still out there, wounded and vengeful. But for the first time since Thomas's death, she wasn't alone. She had allies, friends. And riding beside her was a man who had risked everything to protect her, not out of desire or duty, but out of a simple belief in justice and human dignity. The night air was cool against her face, the rhythm of the horse beneath her steady and reassuring. Ruth's hand went to her pocket, where Thomas's Bible rested safe against her heart. She thought he would approve of the woman she was becoming, stronger, more resilient, willing to fight for what was right. "Thank you," she whispered, though whether to Thomas, to God, or to the vast, indifferent stars above, even she couldn't say. Beside her, Jedediah rode in silence, his wounded arm held carefully against his body. His home was gone, his possessions destroyed. Yet there was a lightness to his bearing that Ruth hadn't seen before, as though some burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Perhaps, she thought, this was what redemption looked like. Not a dramatic moment of divine intervention, but the slow, painful process of one human being helping another through the darkness. Of finding purpose in protection, meaning in sacrifice. The group crested a small rise, and ahead Ruth could see the glow of campfires in the distance. Shelter safety, at least for tonight. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own decisions. But for now, it was enough to be alive, to be moving forward, together. The camp was larger than Ruth had expected. Nearly 30 men gathered around several fires, their faces grim with purpose in the flickering light. Some she recognized from Oak Ridge, others were strangers likely from neighboring communities. All looked up as their party approached, conversations falling silent. Samuel Thornton dismounted first, helping Ruth from her horse with the courteous manners of an earlier era. Jedediah declined assistance despite his wound, though his face was pale with pain as his boots hit the ground. "This way," Thornton said, guiding them toward the largest fire. "Doctor's waiting." The doctor turned out to be a weary-looking man in his 60s, with spectacles perched on a prominent nose and hands that trembled slightly as he examined Jedediah's wound. Not a surgeon, Ruth guessed, but the closest thing this remote region had to proper medical care. "Clean through," the doctor pronounced, confirming Ezekiel's earlier assessment. "Missed the bone. You're a fortunate man, Mr. Foster." "Indeed," Jedediah replied, his eyes finding Ruth's across the fire. She understood the unspoken sentiment. They had both been fortunate tonight, surviving against odds that should have seen them buried beneath the Texas soil. The doctor cleaned and bandaged Jedediah's arm with efficient movements. "Keep it clean," he instructed. "Change the dressing daily. Come see me in a week if you're able." Jedediah nodded his thanks, then accepted a cup of coffee from one of the men. Ruth was offered the same, along with a tin plate of beans and salt pork. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was before her. They ate in silence, too exhausted for conversation, aware of the curious glances from the men around them. When they had finished, Thornton approached, settling himself on a log across the fire from them. His face was grave in the dancing light. "Mrs. Abernathy," he began, his tone formal, "I must ask you to recount what happened between you and Clayton Hargrove. For the record." Ruth tensed her hand, tightening around her coffee cup. The prospect of sharing her shame, her violation with this group of strange men, was almost unbearable. Sensing her discomfort, Thornton added, "Only to me and Judge Wilkins." He gestured to a stern-faced older man sitting nearby. "We need sworn testimony if we're to bring charges against Clayton." Ruth glanced at Jedediah, who nodded encouragingly. "It's necessary," he said softly, "for justice to be done." Taking a deep breath, Ruth followed Thornton and the judge to a more private spot at the edge of the camp. There, her voice barely above a whisper at first, but growing stronger, she recounted the months of torment, Clayton's initial demands for protection money, his later insistence on payment of a more personal nature, and finally, the night she had defended herself with the kitchen knife. The men listened without interruption, their expressions carefully neutral. When she finished, Judge Wilkins cleared his throat. "Mrs. Abernathy," he said, "I've been a judge in this county for 27 years, seen all manner of human cruelty." He removed his spectacles, polishing them with a handkerchief. "What you've described is not just a crime against you, but against the very law Clayton was sworn to uphold." "Then you believe me?" Ruth asked, hardly daring to hope. "I do," Wilkins confirmed. "And more importantly, I have corroborating testimony from 3 other widows who suffered similar treatment at Clayton's hands. Women who were too afraid to speak until now." Relief washed over Ruth so profound, she felt momentarily dizzy. She was not alone. She had not been Clayton's only victim. And now, at last, someone in authority was listening. "What happens now?" she asked. "We've sent riders to Fort Richardson," Thornton explained. "The Union commander there needs to be informed of his appointed sheriff's activities. Clayton will be removed from office, arrested, if he can be found." "And if he can't," Thornton's expression hardened, "then he'll be a fugitive. In this territory, that's practically a death sentence. No friends, no supplies, nowhere to hide." Ruth nodded, accepting this. It wasn't the formal justice of a trial and hanging, but perhaps it was justice nonetheless. Clayton, who had terrorized so many, would now live in terror himself. They returned to the main fire where Jedediah sat deep in conversation with Ezekiel. Both men looked up as Ruth approached, their expressions questioning. "It's done," she said, simply taking her place beside Jedediah. Conversation around the fire gradually resumed, the men discussing plans for the coming days, organizing search parties for Clayton and his remaining loyalists, arranging for the rebuilding of Jedediah's home. Ruth listened with half-an-ear exhaustion washing over her in waves now that the immediate danger had passed. "You should rest," Jedediah said, noticing her drooping eyelids. "There's a tent set aside for you over there." He nodded toward a small canvas shelter at the edge of the camp. Ruth wanted to protest that she wasn't tired, but the words wouldn't come. She was bone-weary, her body and mind pushed beyond endurance these past days. "What about you?" she asked instead. "I'll keep watch a while longer," Jedediah replied. "Old habits." Ruth nodded, too tired to argue. She rose, making her way to the tent on legs that felt like lead. Inside, someone had laid out blankets on a crude pallet of straw. It looked more inviting than the finest feather bed. She sank down, not even bothering to remove her boots, and was asleep almost before her head touched the rough canvas that served as a pillow. Her dreams were chaotic fragments of the past days swirling together with older memories. Thomas marched away to war, but when he turned back to wave, he had Clayton's face. Jedediah's house burned, the flames taking the shape of dancing figures. Ruth ran through an endless maze of tunnels pursued by unseen enemies calling for help that never came. She woke with a start, heart pounding, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Dawn light filtered through the canvas painting the interior of the tent in shades of gold. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the camp stirring men's voices, the nickering of horses, the clatter of cooking implements. Ruth sat up, running her fingers through her tangled hair in a futile attempt to bring order to it. Her dress was filthy, torn in places, stiff with dust and sweat. She longed for clean clothes, for water to wash away the grime of the past days, but such luxuries would have to wait. Emerging from the tent, she found the camp already active. Men were saddling horses, checking weapons, preparing for the day's search. At the central fire, Ezekiel was tending a pot of coffee, his movements spry despite his age. "Morning, child," he greeted her, offering a steaming cup. "Sleep well." "As well as could be expected," Ruth replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Where's Jedediah?" Ezekiel nodded toward the edge of the camp. "Talking with Thornton, planning what comes next." Ruth followed his gaze. Jedediah stood with Thornton and several other men examining what appeared to be a map spread across the hood of a wagon. His wounded arm was held carefully at his side, but otherwise he showed no sign of the previous night's ordeal. As if sensing her attention, Jedediah looked up, meeting her gaze across the camp. He said something to Thornton, then made his way toward her. "You look better," he observed as he reached her. Ruth gave a small, rueful laugh. "I doubt that very much. I must look a fright." "You look alive," Jedediah clarified. "Which is what matters." He was right, of course. After coming so close to death, mere appearance seemed trivial. Still, Ruth couldn't help but be conscious of her bedraggled state, especially surrounded by so many men. "Is there somewhere I might freshen up?" she asked. Jedediah nodded. "There's a stream just beyond those trees. I'll have Ezekiel walk you there. Stand guard while you wash." "Thank you," Ruth said, touched by his consideration. The stream was small but clear, running between banks lined with cottonwoods and willows. Ezekiel stationed himself at a discreet distance. His back turned while Ruth gratefully washed her face and hands in the cool water. She couldn't do much about her dress, but she managed to comb her hair with her fingers and rebraid it into a semblance of neatness. When she returned to camp, she found breakfast waiting: salt pork hardtack and more coffee. Not a feast by any measure, but Ruth was hungry enough not to care. "What's the plan?" she asked Jedediah as they ate. "Thornton's organizing search parties," he replied. "They'll comb the surrounding territory for Clayton and his men. The rest of us will head back toward Oak Ridge, meet up with the Union troops coming from Fort Richardson." "And then," Jedediah hesitated. "That depends on what the military commander decides. Clayton was his appointee, after all. He may want to conduct his own investigation." Ruth felt a flicker of anxiety. "What if he doesn't believe us? What if he sides with Clayton?" "He'll believe us," Jedediah assured her. "There are too many witnesses now, too much evidence. And Thornton has influence. He fought for the Confederacy, but he's respected by both sides. His word carries weight." Ruth nodded, wanting to believe him. After coming so far, surviving so much, the thought that Clayton might somehow escape justice was unbearable. They broke camp within the hour, the main group heading east toward Oak Ridge, while smaller parties split off to search for the fugitives. Ruth and Jedediah rode with Thornton and the judge, along with Ezekiel and about a dozen other men. The day was clear and cool, a perfect autumn morning that belied the violence of the previous night. As they rode, Ruth found herself studying the landscape with new eyes. This harsh, beautiful country had nearly claimed her life, yet there was a stark majesty to it that touched something deep within her. "What will you do?" she asked Jedediah, who rode beside her. "After all this is settled." He considered the question, his gaze on the horizon. "Rebuild, I suppose. My home, my life. In the same place?" "Yes." His tone allowed no argument. "That land is mine. I won't be driven from it." Ruth nodded, understanding his determination. "And your work with Ezekiel, the underground activities?" Jedediah glanced at her, a hint of surprise in his pale eyes. "That work is largely done now. The war is over, slavery abolished." "But not all battles are won," Ruth observed. "There are still those who would return to the old ways if they could. Men like Clayton." "True," Jedediah acknowledged. "Perhaps there will still be need for safe havens for those who stand against such men." He looked at her directly. "What about you, Ruth? What will you do?" The question caught her off guard. In the chaos of the past days, she hadn't thought beyond survival. I don't know," she admitted. "I can't go back to Oak Ridge. Too many memories." "You could start fresh elsewhere," Jedediah suggested. "You're young still, with your life ahead of you." Ruth considered this. The prospect of leaving Texas, of finding a place where no one knew her story, was tempting. But it also felt like running away. "Or," Jedediah continued, his tone carefully neutral, "you could stay, help me rebuild. The land needs a woman's touch." Ruth looked at him sharply, searching for hidden meaning in his words. But Jedediah's expression remained unreadable, his eyes on the trail ahead. "I'll consider it," she said finally. They rode in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. The miles passed beneath their horses' hooves, bringing them ever closer to Oak Ridge, and whatever resolution awaited them there. It was mid-afternoon when they crested a rise and saw riders approaching from the east, a column of blue-uniformed soldiers, perhaps 20 in all, led by an officer whose insignia gleamed in the sunlight. "Union troops," Thornton observed. "From Fort Richardson, most likely." They continued forward, meeting the soldiers at the bottom of the slope. The officer in charge, a captain by his uniform, raised his hand in greeting. "Samuel Thornton," he called. "That's me," Thornton confirmed, urging his horse forward. "Captain? Reynolds? James Reynolds." The captain's gaze swept over their group, lingering on Ruth, the only woman, before returning to Thornton. "I received your message about Sheriff Hargrove. Disturbing allegations, if true." "They're true," Thornton said firmly. "We have sworn statements from multiple witnesses. Judge Wilkins here has taken their testimony." Reynolds nodded, his expression grave. "I'll need to see those statements. The general will want a full report." "Of course," Thornton agreed. "But first I should tell you Hargrove and several of his men attacked these folks last night." He gestured to Ruth and Jedediah. "Burned a homestead to the ground. They're still at large." Reynolds frowned, clearly displeased by this news. "I wasn't informed of any attack. This complicates matters." "With respect, Captain," Jedediah interjected, "it simplifies them. Clayton Hargrove is not just corrupt, he's dangerous. A threat to the very peace your troops are here to maintain." Reynolds studied Jedediah with narrowed eyes. "And you are?" "Jedediah Foster. The homestead that was burned was mine." "Foster," Reynolds repeated, recognition dawning in his eyes. "The Union surgeon. I've heard of you." Jedediah inclined his head, neither confirming nor denying the identification. "And the lady?" Reynolds asked, turning his attention to Ruth. "Mrs. Ruth Abernathy," Thornton supplied. "A widow from Oak Ridge, one of Hargrove's victims." Reynolds removed his hat, nodding respectfully to Ruth. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for what you've endured." Ruth acknowledged the courtesy with a slight nod, uncomfortable with the attention. She had not expected sympathy from Union soldiers, had been taught to view them as enemies for so long. "We should continue to Oak Ridge," Reynolds decided. "I need to establish a command post, organize a proper search for Hargrove." The combined party set off the soldiers' blue uniforms, a stark contrast to the civilian clothes of Thornton's group. Ruth rode in silence, aware of curious glances from the Union men. She kept her eyes forward, her posture straight, despite her exhaustion. They were perhaps an hour from Oak Ridge, when one of the scouts came galloping back, his horse lathered with exertion. "Riders ahead," he reported breathlessly, "coming fast from the north." Reynolds signaled a halt, organizing his men into a defensive formation with practiced efficiency. Thornton's group followed suit, forming a rough semicircle behind the soldiers. "How many?" Reynolds demanded. "5, maybe 6 panniers," the scout replied. "Hard to tell with the dust." They waited tense and alert as the approaching riders drew nearer. Ruth felt her heart racing, her hand moving instinctively to the revolver Jedediah had given her. Was it Clayton, making one final desperate attack? But as the riders came into view, it became clear they were not attackers. They rode in a tight group, one man slumped in his saddle, clearly wounded. And at their center was a familiar figure, Samuel Thornton's son, Robert, who had led one of the search parties. "Father," Robert called as they approached. "We found them, Clayton and his men." Thornton spurred his horse forward to meet his son. "Where? Holed up in an abandoned mine about 10 miles north," Robert reported. "We exchanged fire. Got one of them, I think, but Luke was hit." He gestured to the wounded man who was being helped from his horse by the soldiers. Captain Reynolds joined them, his expression intent. "How many men does Hargrove have with him?" "4 that we saw," Robert said. "All armed. They have good cover in the mine entrance. We couldn't get close enough for a clear shot." Reynolds nodded, already forming a plan. "We'll need to surround them, cut off any escape routes." He turned to his lieutenant. "Johnson, organize a detachment. 20 men should be sufficient." "Sir," the lieutenant acknowledged. "I'm coming too," Thornton declared. "My men know the territory better than yours." Reynolds considered this, then nodded. "Very well. We'll leave in 1 hour. The rest of the party will continue to Oak Ridge." As preparations began for the new expedition, Ruth sought out Jedediah, who was helping Ezekiel tend to the wounded searcher. "They've found Clayton," she said, her voice tight with emotion. Jedediah looked up, his hands bloody from the bandage he was tying. "I heard. They're going after him. Thornton and the soldiers." "Yes." Ruth took a deep breath. "I want to go with them." Jedediah's expression sharpened. "No, absolutely not." "I need to see it," Ruth insisted. "Need to see him brought to justice. Otherwise, I'll never truly believe it's over." "And it's too dangerous," Jedediah argued. "Clayton is cornered now, which makes him even more deadly. And your presence would be a distraction to the men." Ruth wanted to protest further, but she knew he was right. Her desire to witness Clayton's capture was selfish, born of a need for personal closure rather than justice. "Then you'll stay in Oak Ridge as well?" she asked. Jedediah hesitated, his gaze shifting to the soldiers preparing for the expedition. "No," he said finally. "I'm going with them." "But your wound is not severe enough to keep me from seeing this through," he interrupted. "Clayton burned my home, Ruth. Nearly killed us both. I need to be there when he's taken." Ruth understood then that Jedediah sought the same closure she did, the same assurance that the nightmare was truly ending. She couldn't deny him that even as fear for his safety gnawed at her. "Be careful," she said simply. Jedediah's expression softened. "I will. Ezekiel will accompany you to Oak Ridge. Stay with the widow Parker. She's a friend, will give you shelter until I return." Ruth nodded, accepting the plan, even as she chafed at being left behind. "How long will you be gone?" "A day, 2 at most." Jedediah's tone was reassuring. "The mine is not far, and Clayton has nowhere left to run." An hour later, the expedition departed Captain Reynolds and 15 of his soldiers, along with Thornton Jedediah and 5 local men. Ruth watched them ride away, a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. Logic told her the danger was minimal, Clayton was outnumbered, outgunned, with no hope of escape. But fear was rarely logical, and hers whispered that she might never see Jedediah again. The remainder of the party continued to Oak Ridge, arriving as dusk was settling over the small town. Ruth had not been back since her desperate flight days earlier, and seeing the familiar buildings stirred a complex mix of emotions. This had been her home for her entire life, the place where she had married Thomas, where she had mourned him, where she had endured Clayton's predations. She had never expected to return. The widow Parker proved to be a stout, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. She welcomed Ruth without question, showing her to a small but clean bedroom and providing water for washing. "Mr. Foster is a good man," she said as she helped Ruth settle in. "Saved my Jeremiah's leg after the war when the army doctors wanted to amputate. Never asked for payment, neither." "You've known him long?" Ruth asked, curious about this aspect of Jedediah's life. "Since he came to these parts about 5 years back," Mrs. Parker confirmed. "Keeps to himself mostly, but always helps when needed. Medical care mostly, but other things too." She gave Ruth a knowing look. "Helped some folks who needed to disappear for a while, if you take my meaning." Ruth did take her meaning. Jedediah's work with the Underground Railroad hadn't ended with the war. He had continued to provide sanctuary for those in need, regardless of the personal risk. "He's a good man," Ruth agreed. Mrs. Parker studied her for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "And what are you to him, if you don't mind my asking? Not that it's any of my business, of course." "A friend," Ruth said simply. "Someone he helped when I needed it most." This seemed to satisfy the widow. "Well, any friend of Jedediah Foster is welcome in my home. Now, let's see about getting you some clean clothes. Can't have you wearing that torn dress a moment longer." The next 24 hours passed with excruciating slowness for Ruth. She bathed, changed into a borrowed dress, ate Mrs. Parker's excellent cooking, and tried not to think about what might be happening at the abandoned mine. The widow kept her busy with household tasks, for which Ruth was grateful. Idle hands left too much room for worry. Word came the following evening, delivered by a breathless young boy who had spotted the returning party from the edge of town. "They're coming," he announced to the small crowd that had gathered in the town square. "And they've got prisoners." Ruth stood with Mrs. Parker, her heart pounding as she strained to see through the gathering dusk. The riders appeared first as dark shapes against the horizon, then gradually took form as they approached soldiers in blue, local men in civilian clothes, and in the center, several figures with hands bound slumped in their saddles. She searched anxiously for Jedediah, finally spotting him toward the rear of the column. He rode straight-backed, despite his wound, his expression somber in the fading light. Relief washed over Ruth at the sight of him, so intense it made her knees weak. The party halted in the town square, and Captain Reynolds dismounted, addressing the assembled townspeople. "Citizens of Oak Ridge," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "we have apprehended Clayton Hargrove and 3 of his associates. They will be transported to Fort Richardson for trial on charges of corruption, assault, attempted murder, and arson." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some faces showed satisfaction, others uncertainty or even fear. Clayton had ruled this town for 2 years. His influence wouldn't disappear overnight. Ruth's gaze was drawn to the prisoners. Clayton sat on his horse, head bowed, a bandage visible on his shoulder where she had stabbed him. As if sensing her attention, he looked up, his eyes finding hers in the crowd. The hatred in his gaze was palpable, a living thing that reached across the distance between them. Jedediah had dismounted and was making his way toward her. He looked exhausted, his face drawn with fatigue, but his eyes brightened at the sight of her. "You're safe," Ruth said as he reached her, unable to keep the relief from her voice. "As promised," he replied with the ghost of a smile. "What happened at the mine?" Jedediah's expression sobered. Clayton refused to surrender at first. There was an exchange of fire. One of his men was killed, another wounded. Eventually, they ran out of ammunition and had no choice but to give up. And Clayton, was he injured? No more than he already was. Jedediah nodded toward the prisoners who were being led into the town jail under heavy guard. "He'll face a military tribunal at Fort Richardson. The evidence against him is overwhelming." Ruth nodded, a weight lifting from her shoulders. It was over then. Clayton would face justice for his crimes. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Jedediah said, "we rest. Tomorrow will bring decisions enough." They stayed at Mrs. Parker's that night, Ruth in the small bedroom she had been given Jedediah on a pallet in the sitting room. Despite her exhaustion, Ruth found sleep elusive, her mind too full of the day's events and the uncertainties that lay ahead. What would she do now? Where would she go? Her farm had been all but abandoned these past months, likely falling into ruin. Even if she could reclaim it, did she want to? Could she live again in the place where Clayton had violated her, where every room held memories of Thomas and the life they had briefly shared? And what of Jedediah's offer? To stay with him, help him rebuild. It wasn't a proposal of marriage. She understood that. Jedediah was still grieving his wife and daughter, as she grieved Thomas. But it was an offer of partnership, of shared purpose. A chance to build something new from the ashes of their respective pasts. Morning brought no clarity, but it did bring news. Captain Reynolds had received orders to escort the prisoners to Fort Richardson immediately. The column would depart at noon, taking Clayton and his men to face military justice. "I'd like you to accompany us, Mrs. Abernathy," Reynolds told Ruth over breakfast at Mrs. Parker's table. "Your testimony will be crucial at the tribunal." Ruth glanced at Jedediah, who nodded encouragingly. "Of course," she said. "When will the tribunal be held?" "Within the week, if all goes according to plan," Reynolds replied. "The general is anxious to resolve this matter quickly. Hargrove's actions have embarrassed the military authority in this region." Ruth understood the subtext. Clayton had been a federal appointee. His crimes reflected poorly on those who had placed him in power. They would want to demonstrate swift justice to show that such corruption was not tolerated. "And after the tribunal?" she asked. Reynolds hesitated. "That depends on the verdict. If convicted, Hargrove will likely be imprisoned for a considerable time, possibly executed, given the severity of his crimes." The possibility of Clayton's execution stirred complex emotions in Ruth. She had fantasized about his death during the darkest moments of her ordeal, imagined the relief it would bring. But now faced with the concrete possibility, she felt strangely ambivalent. Would his death truly bring her peace? "I'll be ready to leave at noon," she said, setting the question aside for now. As Reynolds departed, Jedediah lingered, his expression troubled. "You don't have to go," he said when they were alone. "Your written testimony might suffice." "No," Ruth said firmly. "I need to see this through, need to look Clayton in the eye while I tell what he did to me." Jedediah nodded understanding in his pale eyes. "I'll accompany you then." Ruth felt a surge of gratitude. Thank you. But what about your home? The rebuilding? It can wait a few more days, Jedediah said. This is more important. The journey to Fort Richardson took 2 days, the soldiers maintaining a steady pace despite the prisoners in their midst. Ruth rode near the front of the column with Captain Reynolds and Jedediah, avoiding any proximity to Clayton. Still, she could feel his eyes on her back, his hatred, a tangible force even at a distance. Fort Richardson proved to be a substantial installation, stone and timber buildings arranged around a central parade ground, the stars and stripes flying from a tall pole at its center. Soldiers in blue uniforms moved about with purpose, many stopping to stare at the unusual procession as they entered the fort. They were met by the commander, a colonel named Westfield, who listened to Reynolds's report with a grave expression. He ordered Clayton and his men taken to the stockade, then invited Ruth, Jedediah, and the other civilian witnesses to quarters prepared for them. The tribunal will convene tomorrow morning, he informed them. I understand this has been a trying ordeal, especially for you, Mrs. Abernathy. Please be assured that justice will be served. Ruth nodded, too exhausted from the journey to offer more than basic courtesy. She was shown to a small but comfortable room in the officers' quarters, where she collapsed onto the narrow bed, surrendering to sleep almost immediately. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window, and the sounds of military routine outside. Marching feet shouted orders, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. Then memory returned along with the knowledge of what this day would bring. The tribunal was held in the fort's mess hall, cleared of tables, and arranged with a long table at one end, where 3 officers sat in judgment. Witnesses waited on benches to one side, while Clayton and his men were brought in under guard, their hands and feet shackled. Clayton looked diminished, somehow, his arrogance tempered by captivity. He kept his eyes downcast as the charges were read. Multiple counts of assault, corruption, attempted murder, arson. Only when Ruth was called to testify did he look up, his gaze burning with hatred. She walked to the front of the room, conscious of all eyes upon her. Colonel Westfield, serving as chief judge, instructed her to tell her story in her own words. And so she did. Clearly, without embellishment, Ruth recounted Clayton's exploitation of his position, his threats, his assaults. She described the night she had finally fought back the desperate flight that had led her to Jedediah's church, the subsequent attack on his homestead. Throughout her testimony, Clayton stared at her with undisguised loathing. Once he made a sound, a scornful laugh, when she described fighting back, and was sharply reprimanded by the guards. When she finished, Colonel Westfield asked if she had anything to add. Only this, Ruth said, finding her voice stronger than she had expected. Clayton Hargrove took much from me, my dignity, my sense of safety, nearly my life. But he did not take my truth. That remains mine, and I give it to you now in the hope that no other woman will suffer as I have. The colonel nodded, a flicker of genuine respect in his eyes. Thank you, Mrs. Abernathy. You may step down. Other witnesses followed, the widows from Oak Ridge, who had suffered similar treatment, Thornton and his men, who had witnessed the attack on Jedediah's home, and finally Jedediah himself, who confirmed Ruth's account and described the burning of his property. Clayton was permitted to speak in his own defense, but his words were a rambling mixture of denials and accusations. He claimed Ruth had seduced him, then turned against him when he rejected her advances. He portrayed Jedediah as a Union sympathizer who had harbored grudges against Southern men since the war. His arguments grew increasingly incoherent as he spoke, his desperation evident in his wild gestures and raised voice. The tribunal deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, Colonel Westfield's expression was solemn. Clayton Hargrove, he began, this tribunal finds you guilty on all counts. The evidence against you is overwhelming and conclusive. Your actions have dishonored the uniform you once wore and the authority you were entrusted with." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "The sentence of this tribunal is death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn tomorrow." A murmur ran through the assembled witnesses. Ruth felt a strange hollowness in her chest. She had expected to feel triumph, or at least satisfaction. Instead, she felt only a profound weariness. Clayton's face drained of color. "You can't," he began, but the colonel cut him off. "Remove the prisoner," he ordered the guards. "The rest of you are dismissed." Outside in the bright autumn sunlight, Ruth stood alone, trying to process what had just occurred. Justice had been served. Clayton would die for his crimes. Yet the victory felt strangely empty. Jedediah found her there, his expression concerned. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I don't know," Ruth admitted. "I thought I would feel different when it was over." Jedediah nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Vengeance rarely brings the peace we expect." "It's not vengeance," Ruth protested. "It's justice." "Is there a difference?" Jedediah asked softly. The question lingered between them unanswered. In truth, Ruth wasn't sure. The line between justice and vengeance seemed increasingly blurred in her mind. "Will you attend?" Jedediah asked after a moment. "The execution." Ruth considered the question. Did she want to witness Clayton's death? Would it bring closure, or simply add another nightmare to those that already haunted her? "No," she decided. "I've seen enough death. I don't need to see his." Jedediah nodded approval in his eyes. A wise choice. They were invited to dine with the officers that evening, an honor that Ruth found more uncomfortable than flattering. She felt out of place among these men in their crisp blue uniforms with their formal manners and easy camaraderie. Jedediah seemed equally ill at ease, responding to questions about his wartime service with terse, non-committal answers. After dinner, they walked together around the parade ground, the evening air cool against their faces. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, bright and distant. "What will you do now?" Jedediah asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. Ruth had been pondering this question for days, weighing options, considering paths forward. "I don't know," she admitted. "I can't go back to my farm. Too many memories." "You could sell it," Jedediah suggested. "Use the money to start fresh elsewhere." "Perhaps," Ruth hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind. "Did you mean it when you offered to let me stay with you, help you rebuild?" Jedediah stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "I meant it," he said simply. "As what?" Ruth pressed. "A housekeeper, a nurse for your patients, or as a partner," Jedediah clarified. "Someone to share the work, the purpose, the life." He held up a hand as Ruth began to speak. "I'm not proposing marriage, Ruth. I don't think either of us is ready for that. May never be. But I am offering friendship, purpose, a place to belong." Ruth considered his words, finding in them an echo of her own feelings. She wasn't ready for romance, might never be after what Clayton had done to her. But friendship, purpose, belonging, these were things she desperately needed. "I'd like that," she said finally. "To help you rebuild, to see what we might create together." Jedediah's smile was small but genuine, warming his pale eyes. Then it settled. They continued their walk, the decision bringing a sense of peace that Ruth hadn't expected. She was choosing a path forward, not just running from the past. It felt right. "There's something else you should know," Jedediah said after a moment. "Something I've been meaning to tell you, but the time never seemed right." Ruth glanced at him, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" Jedediah hesitated, as if gathering his thoughts. When you first mentioned your husband, Thomas Abernathy of the 18th Virginia, I told you I didn't recall treating him at Gettysburg. Yes, Ruth said, puzzled by this return to a previous conversation. That wasn't entirely true, Jedediah admitted. The name didn't register at first, but later I remembered. He paused, his expression pained. I did treat a Lieutenant Thomas Abernathy at Gettysburg. He was brought to my field hospital with a severe chest wound. I operated, but... He trailed off, the implication clear. Ruth felt her heart constrict. He died on your table, she finished for him. Jedediah nodded, watching her carefully for her reaction. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. Ruth was silent for a long moment, absorbing this new information. Jedediah, the man who had saved her life, had also been present at her husband's death. It was a connection she hadn't expected, a strange twist of fate that linked them across the years and the divisions of war. Did he suffer? She asked finally. No, Jedediah assured her. He was unconscious when they brought him in. He never woke. Ruth nodded, grateful for this small mercy. Did he say anything before? The men who brought him in said he spoke of home, of you. Jedediah's voice was gentle. Said he had a beautiful wife waiting for him in Texas, that he had to get back to her. Tears stung Ruth's eyes, the first she had shed for Thomas in a long time. Thank you, she whispered, for telling me, for trying to save him. Jedediah nodded, understanding in his eyes. I wanted you to know, before we move forward together. They stood in silence for a moment, the shared knowledge creating a new bond between them. Thomas, the man they had both loved in different ways, connecting them across the chasm of war and loss. As they continued their walk, Ruth felt a strange sense of completion, of circles closing. Thomas had died under Jedediah's care. Now she would live under it. There was a symmetry to it that felt almost ordained, as if their paths had been destined to cross. The night passed quietly. Ruth slept better than she had in months, the knowledge that Clayton was securely imprisoned, lifting a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged. When she woke, dawn was just breaking, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. She dressed slowly, aware that at this very moment, Clayton was facing his end. Did he feel remorse, fear, or only the same hatred that had driven him to prey on women like her, to burn Jedediah's home, to threaten and intimidate all who stood against him? In the end, it didn't matter. Clayton's feelings, his final thoughts, these were his alone to bear. Ruth had moved beyond him, beyond the power he had once held over her. She was free now in a way that went deeper than mere physical safety. Jedediah was waiting for her in the mess hall, a cup of coffee in hand. His expression told her it was done. Clayton had met his end. Are you ready to leave? He asked simply. Ruth nodded. Yes, more than ready. They departed Fort Richardson that morning, riding west toward Jedediah's land. Thornton and several other men from Oak Ridge accompanied them, having promised to help with the rebuilding. Ezekiel joined them as well, his ancient mule keeping pace with the younger horses through sheer stubbornness. As they rode, Ruth found her spirits lifting with each mile that separated her from Fort Richardson, from the tribunal, from Clayton's death. The land spread out before them, harsh and beautiful, promising not an easy life, but one of purpose and meaning. There's something I've been wondering, she said to Jedediah as they rode side by side. That night, in the creek bed when Clayton's men had us surrounded, you said there was another exit from the cellar, one that led to the creek. But you never mentioned it during our preparations. Why? Jedediah was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. I wasn't certain it was still passable, he said finally. It hadn't been used in years, might have collapsed. Ruth studied his profile, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. "And," she prompted. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "And I wanted to be sure you could handle yourself in a fight. If it came to that." Understanding dawned. "You were testing me." "Not testing," Jedediah corrected. "Observing. There's a difference." "And did I pass your observation?" Ruth asked, a hint of challenge in her tone. Jedediah's smile broadened slightly. "With flying colors." They continued westward, the conversation turning to practical matters, the rebuilding of the house, the replanting of the garden, the 1,000 tasks that awaited them. Ruth found herself eagerly contributing ideas, suggestions, plans for the future. It felt good to look forward rather than back, to create rather than merely survive. By late afternoon, they had reached Jedediah's land. The sight of the burned ruins, charred timbers, collapsed walls. The skeletal remains of the barn brought a momentary pang of sorrow. So much destruction, so much lost. But as the men began to unload supplies to set up a temporary camp, Ruth felt a surprising sense of homecoming. This scorched earth, this place of violence and loss, would be transformed. They would build something new here, something stronger than what had been destroyed. Ezekiel approached as she stood contemplating the ruins, his aged face creased in a knowing smile. "Thinking about the future child?" he asked. Ruth nodded. "About what we'll build here." "It'll be good," Ezekiel assured her. "Different from what was, but good in its own way." "I hope so," Ruth said. "I want to create something meaningful, something that helps others as Jedediah helped me." Ezekiel's smile deepened. "That's the spirit that rebuilds after war, after loss. Not forgetting the past, but not being bound by it either." They stood together, watching, as Thornton and his men began clearing debris as Jedediah marked out the foundation for the new house. The sun was lowering toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the land. "It won't be easy," Ezekiel said after a moment. "The land is harsh memories, harsher still. There'll be days when the past feels too heavy to bear." "I know," Ruth acknowledged, "but I won't face those days alone anymore. Nor will Jedediah." Ezekiel nodded satisfaction in his dark eyes. "No, not alone. And that makes all the difference." As if hearing his name, Jedediah looked up from his work, his gaze finding Ruth across the busy campsite. He raised a hand in greeting, a question in his eyes. Was she all right? Was this truly what she wanted? Ruth smiled, raising her own hand in response. Yes, she was all right. Yes, this was her choice, her path forward. It would not be an easy road, but it was hers to walk with companions she had chosen freely. The sun sank lower, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. In a few hours, darkness would fall, bringing with it the countless stars that had witnessed so much suffering, so much courage, so much resilience across this vast land. But for now, there was work to be done, a home to build, a future to create. Ruth moved toward Jedediah, toward the foundation he was marking out, toward whatever lay ahead, no longer afraid, no longer alone. Together, they would build something new from the ashes of the old, something strong enough to withstand the harshness of the land, the lingering shadows of the past, something like hope, like home.